I am Chloe. I am 32 years old and the chief financial officer of Sterling Industries, a highly successful medical equipment manufacturer in Connecticut. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I was standing at the altar in a custom silk gown, looking into the eyes of the man I was about to marry, when he leaned into the microphone and gave me his wedding gift. He smiled, looked out at the 300 elite guests, and fired me. He thought he was destroying my life, but he had no idea that his father was about to walk through those doors with a signed contract that would hand the entire company over to me. The Pine Valley Country Club was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight. The air was heavy with the scent of thousands of imported white orchids and hydrangeas. 300 guests were seated on white wooden chairs on the immaculate lawn. These were not just friends and family. These were the elite of Connecticut society. There were suppliers I negotiated with, daily business partners I managed, and investors who held our future in their hands. The string quartet had just finished playing a beautiful classical piece. The priest stood before us holding his leather-bound book, waiting for the vows to be completed. I had just spoken my vows. I promised to stand by him through thick and thin, for richer or poorer. I meant every single word. I had already lived those words for 6 agonizing years. Then it was Brandon's turn. Brandon is 33 years old, handsome, perfectly groomed, and born into a wealth he never had to earn. Instead of looking at me, he turned to his best man and took the wireless microphone that had been set up for the scripture readings. He turned his back to the priest and faced the crowd. He flashed his signature charming smile, the same smile he used to charm clients and manipulate his family. I thought he was going to say something romantic. I thought he was going to make a grand loving gesture. Instead, his voice echoed clearly across the sprawling green lawn. "I know we are all gathered here today to witness a union," Brandon said, his voice dripping with absolute confidence. "But as of yesterday afternoon, my father officially signed over the role of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Industries to me." A polite ripple of applause swept through the crowd. Brandon held up his hand to quiet them, and as my very first executive decision, he continued, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, calculating cruelty. "I am restructuring my life and my company. Chloe, I have a wedding gift for you. You are fired. Your services at Sterling Industries and in my personal life are no longer required. You are too controlling, too suffocating, and I am finally taking back my freedom." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the air. 300 people froze. You could hear the faint rustle of the oak leaves in the breeze. No one moved. No one spoke. My heart stopped beating. I stood there holding a bouquet of white peonies, completely paralyzed. The words echoed in my mind over and over again. "You are fired. Your services are no longer required." The humiliation crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I could feel the burning stares of hundreds of people drilling into my skin. While Brandon stood there looking incredibly proud of his public execution, my mind did what it always does in a crisis. It bypassed the emotion and went straight to the numbers. 6 years. That is exactly how long I had bled for this man and his family. When I first joined Sterling Industries as a junior accountant, the company was hemorrhaging cash. It was a vital business that manufactured home oxygen concentrators and mobility aids, but internally, it was a mess. Brandon was the vice president of sales at the time. He spent more hours on this very golf course than he ever did in his office. But his absence was not the real problem. The real problem was his greed. Brandon had been quietly dipping into the operational funds to cover his gambling debts, his lavish vacations with friends, and his completely failed side investments. The company was 6 months away from bankruptcy when I found the discrepancies in the ledgers. I could have reported him. I should have reported him to his father, Richard Sterling, the founder of the company. Richard was a hard-working, honest man who built the business from a single small warehouse. But I went to Brandon first. I wanted to give him a chance to explain. That night in his office, Brandon broke down. He cried bitter tears. He fell to his knees and begged me to help him fix it. He told me he was terrified of disappointing his father. He swore he would change. And like a naive, trusting fool, I believed him. I fell in love with his vulnerability. I decided to save him. For 6 years, I worked 70 hours a week. I gave up my weekends, my holidays, and my youth. I restructured our entire capital expenditure model. I flew on red-eye flights across the country to renegotiate contracts with angry suppliers that Brandon had offended. I personally saved the company millions of dollars through sheer willpower and financial strategy. I deferred my own bonuses to quietly replace the money he had stolen, so the annual audits would pass without raising red flags. Every time I was exhausted to the point of collapsing, Brandon would hold me in his arms. He would kiss my forehead and whisper sweet promises in the dark. He told me that my sacrifices were for our future. He said we were building an empire together. He promised that once his father retired, we would rule the company side by side as husband and wife. I poured my soul into his family legacy because I truly believed it was going to be my legacy too. Now standing on this sunlit altar, the brutal reality shattered my delusions. He never loved me. He never respected me. To him, I was nothing more than a human shield. I was the cleanup crew for his messes. And now that his father had finally handed over the title of CEO, Brandon did not need his shield anymore. He did not need the woman who knew he was a fraud. He wanted to rule the kingdom I had built, and he wanted to do it without the burden of my knowing eyes watching his every move. I looked past Brandon to the front row of white chairs. Susan, his mother, sat perfectly upright. She was wearing a pale silver dress that looked suspiciously like a wedding gown. Susan had hated me from the moment Brandon brought me home. To her, I was just a working-class girl from a public school who was trying to steal her wealthy, perfect son. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my background, my clothes, and my dedication to my career. She never knew that her perfect son was financially incompetent. She never knew that my endless hours of work were the only reason she could still afford her luxurious country club lifestyle. As Brandon lowered the microphone, Susan did not look shocked. She looked entirely vindicated. She smiled a tight, smug smile. Beside her sat Jessica, Brandon's older sister. Jessica had never worked a single day in her life. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and Pilates classes funded entirely by the company dividends I managed. As Brandon's cruel words hung in the air, Jessica actually stood up. She started clapping. She laughed out loud, pointing at me standing alone on the altar. The cruelty was physical. It felt like I was being stoned in the public square by the very people I had sacrificed my life to protect. I looked out at the sea of faces. The business partners I had spent years building relationships with were whispering to each other behind their hands. Some looked horrified. Some looked deeply uncomfortable. But nobody intervened. Nobody stood up to stop this public humiliation. My parents were not in the crowd to defend me. They passed away in a tragic car accident 4 years ago. Brandon knew I was completely alone in the world. He knew I had no safety net. He calculated that this brutal public execution would leave me so broken, so destitute, and so humiliated that I would crawl away into the shadows and never speak a word of his incompetence to anyone. He called me controlling. He told 300 people that I suffocated his vision. But my control was the only thing that kept him out of a federal prison cell. Brandon stepped closer to me. The charming smile dropped from his face, replaced by a sneer of pure arrogance. He leaned in so close that only I could hear his next words over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Pack your desk by 5 o'clock on Monday morning," he whispered, his tone dripping with malice. "And leave the ring on my desk. It belongs to my family, not you." He was talking about the 2-carat diamond engagement ring currently sitting on my left hand. He had always claimed it was a precious family heirloom passed down from his grandmother. But I was the chief financial officer. I saw the credit card statements. I knew exactly which jewelry store he bought it from, and I was the one who quietly adjusted his salary draw to ensure he could pay the monthly installments. The absolute audacity of this man was staggering. He was waiting for me to break. He wanted a spectacular scene. He wanted me to fall to my knees, cry, and beg for my job and my relationship. He wanted to solidify his new power as the undisputed king of Sterling Industries by watching me shatter into a million pieces. But I did not cry. The initial shock was already fading, replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. It is the kind of clarity that only comes when you stare at a perfectly balanced ledger and finally find the source of the missing funds. I looked down at my hands holding the bouquet of peonies. They were not shaking. I looked up at the man who had just destroyed my life. I did not see my future husband anymore. I saw a massive liability. I saw a bad debt that I needed to write off permanently. Accountants are trained to look for patterns. We are trained to find the missing variables that others overlook. Standing on that altar, the variables finally aligned in my mind. For months, Brandon had insisted on a long engagement. He pushed the wedding date back twice, ensuring it landed on the exact same week his father was scheduled to step down due to failing health. 2 weeks ago, Richard Sterling was admitted to the hospital for a serious cardiac event. Brandon used his father's vulnerable state to expedite the transition of power. He convinced Richard to sign the final executive transfer documents, early claiming he wanted to take the burden off the old man's shoulders so we could enjoy our honeymoon without corporate stress. It was a brilliant, predatory move. Brandon needed me to keep the company profitable just long enough for his father to hand over the absolute authority. Once he had the legal title of CEO, he could discard me without consequence. He thought I was just a quiet, obedient number cruncher. He thought my silence over the years was a sign of weakness and blind loyalty. But accountants know where every single penny is buried. We know the administrative passwords. We know the hidden offshore accounts. We have the encrypted backups of the deleted emails. As Brandon turned his back on me to walk down the aisle alone, basking in the applause of his cruel sister and his enabling mother, I took a deep, steadying breath. I gently placed my beautiful bridal bouquet on the wooden altar. I reached up and unfastened the long, expensive silk veil from my hair. I let it fall gracefully to the grass. I did not run away in tears. I stood my ground, squaring my shoulders, looking out at the crowd of people who thought they were witnessing the total destruction of my life. They had no idea they were actually witnessing my liberation. The chains of obligation, guilt, and misplaced love had just been severed by the very man who put them on me. And now there was nothing holding me back from burning his fraudulent empire to the ground. The piercing sound of hands slapping together shattered the dead silence of the country club lawn. It was a slow, mocking rhythm that echoed across the rows of white folding chairs. I turned my head slightly, my eyes tracking the source of the noise. Jessica was standing up. Brandon's older sister had always resented me, but in this moment her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph. She wore a custom silk dress that cost more than my first car, a dress paid for by the quarterly dividends I had personally restructured to ensure she never had to work a day in her life. She stepped out of her row and walked into the center aisle, her designer heels sinking slightly into the manicured grass. She kept clapping, her eyes locked onto mine with a predatory gleam. "Let us give a massive round of applause for the gold-digging accountant who almost pulled off the greatest heist of the century," Jessica announced. Her voice was loud, carrying easily to the back rows, where the junior staff members were seated. "You really thought you could trap him, didn't you, Chloe? You thought you could just crunch some numbers, play the devoted little martyr, and manipulate your way into the Sterling family fortune." A low murmur rippled through the elite crowd. Some guests looked down at their laps, deeply uncomfortable with the public spectacle, but others, the old money wives and trust fund heirs, who had always viewed me as an outsider, were leaning in. They were watching me exactly the way you watch a tragic accident on the side of the highway. Jessica took another step toward the altar, emboldened by her brother's cruel victory. "You are nothing but a glorified human calculator," she sneered. "You spent the last 6 years pretending to care about this family, pretending to be some corporate savior, when all you really wanted was to climb the social ladder and secure a permanent seat at our dinner table. Well, my brother finally woke up. He realized you are just the help, and the help does not get to wear the family diamonds." The absolute hypocrisy of her words hit me like a physical blow. The help. That was how she saw the woman who had spent hundreds of hours untangling her personal tax liabilities. When Jessica decided to open a boutique fitness studio 3 years ago, a vanity project that bled money from day one, it was the help who stepped in to negotiate with her furious landlord. It was the help who buried her massive operational losses in a convoluted subsidiary account so her father would not cut off her trust fund. I had shielded her from the consequences of her own staggering incompetence, and this was my reward. She was standing in front of 300 people, reducing my 6 years of blood, sweat, and tears to the desperate scheming of a social climber. Before I could even process the sheer venom in Jessica's voice, Susan stood up. The matriarch of the Sterling family did not need to shout. She did not need to make a loud scene like her daughter. Susan wielded her power with quiet, devastating precision. She smoothed the skirt of her pale silver gown and offered the crowd a serene, apologetic smile, playing the perfect hostess, even as she actively destroyed my life. "I am so sorry to all our esteemed guests for this unpleasant disruption," Susan said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But as a mother, my only priority is the protection of my son and the legacy of our family company. Brandon has made a difficult but necessary executive decision today. We simply cannot allow individuals with questionable motives to jeopardize everything my husband built." She turned her gaze to me, and the artificial warmth vanished entirely. Her eyes were like flat gray stones. She looked at me not as a person, but as a stain on her perfect lawn that needed to be scrubbed away. "Security!" Susan called out, her tone sharp and authoritative. From the edges of the garden, 2 large men in dark suits stepped onto the grass. They were the private security contractors hired to keep uninvited guests out of the wedding. Now they were being summoned to remove the bride. "Please escort this former employee off the premises," Susan commanded, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "She is trespassing on private property, and her presence is upsetting the guests. Make sure she leaves immediately." The sheer degradation of that moment is something I will never forget. A former employee. Trespassing. I was standing in my custom bridal gown, a dress I had saved up for months to afford, holding the remnants of a life I thought I was building, and I was being treated like an unruly vagrant who had wandered in off the street. The 2 security guards exchanged an uncertain glance, clearly uncomfortable with the task of physically removing a bride from the altar, but they began to walk toward me. Brandon stepped forward, raising his hand to stop the guards temporarily. He was not finished with me yet. The public humiliation was not enough. He needed to assert his dominance to prove to his mother, his sister, and his high society friends that he was the absolute master of this situation. "Not just yet," Brandon said, walking up the short wooden steps to stand inches away from me. "You still have company property, Chloe. And since you are officially terminated as of this exact moment, I need to revoke your access to our corporate infrastructure. Hand over your phone." I stared at him, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer pettiness of his demand. "You are doing this right now?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "Right here in front of everyone." "I am protecting my company from a disgruntled former employee," he replied smoothly, a smug smile playing on his lips. "You know all our administrative passwords. You have access to our entire financial database. For all I know, you could try to sabotage our accounts out of spite. Give me the phone, Chloe. I will not ask you again." I had the phone tucked into a small hidden pocket sewn into the lining of my gown. It was my primary device, the one I used to manage the endless stream of corporate crises that Brandon created. I shook my head, taking a slow step back. The phone contained my personal data, my contacts, my life. I was not going to hand it over to him like an obedient child. "I will mail it to the Human Resources Department on Monday," I said firmly, refusing to break eye contact. "Do not touch me, Brandon." His smug smile vanished, replaced by a flash of raw, aggressive anger. He hated being defied, especially in public. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin through the delicate lace sleeve of my dress. With his other hand, he aggressively reached toward my hidden pocket. I tried to pull away, my heart hammering against my ribs, but he was stronger. He yanked the device from my dress, holding it up like a trophy. "You do not dictate terms to me anymore," he sneered, tossing my phone to his best man standing nearby. "Put that in the safe in the manager's office. I will have the IT department wipe it completely on Monday morning." He was breathing heavily, fueled by the adrenaline of his own cruelty. He reached into his own tuxedo jacket and pulled out his personal smartphone. I watched his fingers fly across the screen. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was logging into the executive portal to manually disable my user credentials, ensuring I could not access the network from a backup device. He was meticulously locking me out of the empire I had spent 6 years saving from ruin. But as he held his phone up, tapping furiously on the glass, a bright white push notification banner dropped down from the top of his screen. He was standing so close to me that the text was impossible to miss. My eyes naturally locked onto the glaring notification. It was a text message from a contact saved simply as Davis Vulturecap. The preview of the message was short, direct, and devastating. "The transition is confirmed. Ready to initiate asset liquidation on Monday. Have the severance packages drafted. For a fraction of a second time, simply stopped. The gentle breeze, the murmuring crowd, the harsh grip of Brandon's hand on my arm, all of it faded away. In that singular moment, my brain stopped acting like a betrayed bride and reverted completely to the sharp analytical mind of a chief financial officer. Vulture Capital. I knew exactly who they were. Everyone in the corporate finance sector knew who they were. They were a notorious private equity firm operating out of New York. They were not investors. They were corporate scavengers. Their entire business model revolved around executing hostile takeovers or acquiring vulnerable family-owned manufacturing businesses. Once they had control, they did not build the company up. They stripped it down to the bone. They sold off the valuable patents, liquidated the physical real estate, fired the entire local workforce to outsource labor to cheaper markets, and then bankrupted the remaining shell of the corporation to claim massive tax write-offs. They were ruthless, bloodthirsty, and highly efficient at destroying generational legacies for a quick profit. I stared at the glowing screen of Brandon's phone as the notification vanished. The missing variables snapped into place with terrifying precision. The sudden termination. The aggressive confiscation of my phone. The rush to take the CEO title from his ailing father while he was stuck in a hospital bed. Brandon was not firing me because I was too controlling. He was not firing me because he wanted his freedom. He was firing me because he was selling Sterling Industries to a chop shop, and I was the only person on the planet who could stop him. I was the only one who knew the true valuation of the company's manufacturing patents. I was the only one who knew about the hidden tax liabilities Brandon had created with his reckless spending. If Vulture Capital came in to audit the books for an acquisition, they would use Brandon's financial incompetence as leverage to buy the company for pennies on the dollar. Brandon was desperate for a massive immediate payout to cover the secret debts he was still hiding from his family. He was willing to sell his father's life work, betray hundreds of loyal employees, and destroy a respected local business just to line his own pockets and escape the consequences of his actions. And he knew that as long as I was the chief financial officer, I would never allow that sale to happen. I would have flagged the liquidation plan to the board of directors. I would have shown his father the exact math of how Vulture Capital planned to gut the workforce. I would have protected the company just like I always did. To execute his massive betrayal, Brandon needed complete darkness. He needed to remove the only person who knew how to read the warning signs. The entire spectacle of this wedding, the public humiliation, the dramatic firing on the altar, it was all a calculated smokescreen. He wanted to frame my departure as a messy, emotional breakup, so that no one in the corporate office would question why the CFO was suddenly gone. He wanted the narrative to be about a gold-digging woman being cast aside, rather than a competent executive being forcibly removed to facilitate a massive corporate betrayal. A cold, electric shock ran down my spine. The betrayal was no longer just about a broken heart. It was about the destruction of hundreds of livelihoods. It was about the utter disrespect for a man who had built an honest business from nothing. Brandon was standing in front of me, breathing heavily, completely unaware that he had just handed me the key to his entire fraudulent scheme. He looked at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for the breakdown. He thought he had broken the naive, loyal woman who had loved him. He had absolutely no idea that he had just awakened the ruthless, calculated financial executive who knew exactly how to dismantle his life. The heavy hands of the private security guards clamped down on my arms. They did not drag me kicking and screaming because I refused to give Susan and Jessica the satisfaction of a breakdown. Instead, I walked with my head held high and my spine rigid, while the two massive men in dark suits flanked me like I was a criminal being escorted from a courtroom. The walk from the sunlit lawn to the main clubhouse felt like navigating a gauntlet. Every step took me further away from the life I had meticulously planned and deeper into a nightmare. We moved through the heavy glass doors, leaving the murmuring crowd behind, and entered the quiet and air-conditioned corridors of the country club. The silence inside was almost more oppressive than the public humiliation outside. The guards marched me down a long hallway lined with vintage golf photographs and landscape paintings, finally stopping in front of the heavy oak door of the bridal lounge. One of them pushed the door open and gestured for me to step inside. The room was exactly as I had left it an hour ago. My makeup brushes were still scattered across the lighted vanity. Half-empty glasses of sparkling water sat on the coffee table. My overnight bag rested in the corner, packed for a honeymoon to the Amalfi Coast. That would never happen. The guard stepped back, pulled the door shut, and the lock clicked into place from the outside. I was trapped. I stood in the center of the plush pink carpet, breathing in the scent of hairspray and expensive perfume that lingered in the air. I walked slowly over to the vanity and looked at my reflection in the massive mirror. The woman looking back at me was pale, her dark hair perfectly styled, and her custom silk gown pristine. I did not look like a woman whose heart had just been ripped out. I looked like a woman who had just survived a disaster and was calculating the damages. The sting of betrayal was still hot in my chest, but the notification I had seen on Brandon's phone anchored me. Vulture Capital, hostile takeover, asset liquidation. The pieces were swirling in my mind, forming a terrifying picture of corporate sabotage. Before I could fully assemble the puzzle, the heavy oak door swung open. Brandon stepped into the room, locking the door firmly behind him. The charming and confident persona he had worn on the altar was completely gone. The man standing before me now was the real Brandon, arrogant, entitled, and brimming with a toxic and predatory energy. He loosened his silk bow tie with a sharp tug and unbuttoned the top of his crisp white shirt. He looked at me not with an ounce of guilt or regret, but with the annoyed impatience of someone dealing with a minor administrative hurdle. "I thought you would be crying by now," Brandon said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "You always were too rigid for your own good. A normal woman would be in tears, but you were just standing there analyzing the situation. That is exactly why I had to get rid of you, Chloe. You never knew how to turn off the spreadsheet in your head." I did not offer him a response. I just watched him pace across the room. He walked over to the coffee table, picked up one of the crystal glasses, and took a slow sip of the flat water. The sheer casualness of his behavior was staggering. He had just publicly executed our 6-year relationship in front of 300 people, and he was treating this private conversation like a routine human resources exit interview. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded stack of thick legal paper. He tossed it onto the glass vanity right in front of me. It landed with a dull and heavy thud. Next to it, he dropped a cashier's check. "That is a standard non-disclosure agreement," Brandon said, pointing to the paperwork. "And that check is for $50,000. It is your severance package. You are going to sign the document, take the money, and walk out the back door of this club. You will never speak about our relationship. You will never discuss the internal finances of Sterling Industries, and you will never contact my family again." I looked down at the documents. My eyes traced the printed numbers on the check. $50,000. The absolute insult of that number washed over me. I had personally saved his father's company millions. I had deferred my own bonuses, worked countless unpaid hours, and sacrificed my physical health to keep his fraudulent mistakes hidden from the auditors. I had built a fortress around his incompetence, and he believed that a meager $50,000 would buy my silence while he burned that fortress to the ground. "You must be joking," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet completely steady. "You think $50,000 covers 6 years of my life? You think this piece of paper will keep me quiet about the millions I covered up for you?" Brandon chuckled with a harsh and grating sound that made my stomach turn. He leaned his hands on the vanity, trapping me between his arms, with his face inches from mine. "It is not a negotiation, Chloe," he snarled softly. "You are a smart girl. You know how this works. You have no family to fall back on. You have no wealthy connections in this town. If you refuse to sign that agreement, I will make sure you are blacklisted from every financial institution on the East Coast. I will tell the board that you were embezzling funds. I will bury you in so much litigation that you will spend the rest of your life paying off legal fees. Take the money, sign the paper, disappear." I looked directly into his eyes, searching for a trace of the man I thought I loved. There was nothing there. Only a void of greed and entitlement. But I also saw something else in his posture. He was defensive. He was rushing this. He needed my signature immediately. He was desperate for my silence, and that desperation was a massive vulnerability. "Why the rush, Brandon?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. "If you are the absolute king of the company now, why do you care what a fired accountant has to say? Why the public spectacle? You could have fired me on Monday morning. You chose to do it on the altar because you needed a distraction. You needed everyone looking at the dramatic breakup, so they would not look at the company books." His jaw tightened. A flash of genuine surprise crossed his face quickly, masked by a sneering laugh. "You always think you are the smartest person in the room, do you not?" "I do not think I am the smartest person in the room," I replied. "I just know you are the most reckless." "What did you do, Brandon? What catastrophic hole did you dig this time that forced you to call Vulture Capital?" The mention of the private equity firm hit him like a physical strike. He stood up straight and took a sudden step back. He stared at me with wide eyes, clearly wondering how I had managed to put the pieces together so quickly. But Brandon's ego was always his fatal flaw. He could never resist the opportunity to boast about his own perceived brilliance, especially when he thought he had already won. "You saw the text message," he said, his lips curling into a triumphant and ugly smile. "Fine. You want to know the truth. You want to know why I had to cut you loose. You were standing in my way, Chloe. You always insisted on playing by the rules. You wanted slow and steady growth. You wanted to build my father's boring little medical supply business the traditional way. But I am not my father. I do not want to wait 20 years to build a fortune." He began pacing the room again, waving his hands as he spoke, caught up in the delusion of his own grand strategy. "6 months ago, I took out a series of shadow mortgages against our 3 main manufacturing plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania," he confessed, his voice rising with arrogant pride. "I leveraged the physical real estate through a shell company my mother helped me set up. I took the cash and moved it into aggressive tech portfolios and high-yield crypto markets. It was supposed to be a sure thing. A massive return. I would pay off the shadow mortgages before the annual audit, keep the profit, and no one would ever know." I felt the blood run cold in my veins. Shadow mortgages on our primary manufacturing facilities. He had risked the very infrastructure of Sterling Industries, the factories that employed hundreds of hardworking people, on highly volatile speculative trading. "But the market tanked," I said, finishing his thought for him. "The investments crashed. You lost the capital, and now the shadow mortgages are coming due." "Exactly," Brandon snapped, pointing a finger at me. "The balloon payments hit next month. If you were still the chief financial officer, you would have found the liens during the quarterly review. You would have run crying to my father. He would have fired me, cut me out of the trust, and given the company to someone else. I could not let you do that. I had to secure the CEO title before my father's health failed completely." I stared at him, absorbing the magnitude of his betrayal. The entire timeline of our engagement suddenly made horrifying sense. Every romantic gesture, every delay in the wedding planning, every time he insisted we spend our evenings at his father's hospital bedside, playing the role of the devoted son and dutiful future daughter-in-law. It was all a carefully orchestrated theater. He needed his father to believe the company was in safe hands. He needed Richard to sign over the executive power willingly. This wedding was nothing but a prop, a stage play designed to lull a sick old man into a peaceful retirement so his son could legally destroy his life's work. "So you staged this wedding," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the storm raging in my chest. "You walked me down the aisle just to fire me, making it look like a tragic lover's quarrel, so the board of directors would write off my sudden departure as personal drama instead of professional sabotage. And now you are selling the company to Vulture Capital to cover your massive debts. Vulture Capital is buying the assets for 30 cents on the dollar." Brandon said, his chest puffing out as if he had just negotiated a brilliant business deal. "They absorb the shadow mortgages, they liquidate the manufacturing plants, and I walk away with a clean slate and a hefty 8-figure payout for facilitating the acquisition. It is a flawless exit strategy. The board will be furious, but as the new CEO with majority executive control, there is absolutely nothing they can do to stop me." He walked back over to the vanity and tapped his index finger sharply against the non-disclosure agreement. "But none of that concerns you anymore, Chloe. Your role in this company, and in this family, is officially over. You are going to sign this document. You are going to take this pathetic little check, and you are going to walk away quietly. If you try to warn my father, if you try to blow the whistle to the board, I swear to you I will destroy whatever is left of your miserable life." The sheer scale of his sociopathy was breathtaking. For 6 years I had shared a bed with this man. I had cooked him dinner, held his hand through family crises, and genuinely believed we were partners. I had defended him against his critics in the corporate world. Now I realized I had been living with a predator who viewed my loyalty as nothing more than a convenient resource to be exploited and discarded. He did not just betray me. He betrayed his father, a man who had worked his fingers to the bone for 40 years. He betrayed the factory workers in Ohio and Pennsylvania, who relied on those paychecks to feed their families. He was willing to sacrifice hundreds of innocent people just to protect his own ego and cover up his staggering financial incompetence. The air in the bridal lounge felt thick and heavy. The scent of the imported flowers outside seemed to mock the absolute rot inside this room. Brandon crossed his arms, tapping his foot impatiently on the plush carpet. He was waiting for my surrender. He was waiting for the tears to finally fall for the broken and discarded bride, to accept her defeat and sign her rights away for a fraction of her actual worth. I picked up the heavy and gold-plated pen from the glass vanity. The metal was cold against my skin. I felt Brandon's posture relax slightly. He exhaled a sharp breath of victory, assuming he had successfully bullied me into submission. He thought my silence was the silence of a victim who had finally realized she was beaten. He had no idea it was the silence of a predator locking onto its prey. I held the pen loosely in my fingers, staring down at the signature line on the non-disclosure agreement. I was not a victim. I was the chief financial officer of Sterling Industries, and I was about to execute the most brutal audit of his life. I stared at the thick stack of paper on the glass vanity. The golden pen in my hand felt heavy, but not from defeat. It felt heavy with opportunity. Brandon stood over me, his chest puffed out, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just checkmated his only opponent. He was waiting for the final act of my submission. He expected me to weep, to beg, to scrawl my name across the dotted line, and run out the back doors of the country club in absolute disgrace. But an accountant never signs a binding legal document without reading the fine print. And a woman who had spent 6 years cleaning up the financial disasters of a reckless heir never walks into a trap without a contingency plan. I forced my hand to tremble. It was not a difficult performance to summon, considering the sheer adrenaline surging through my veins. I let my shoulders slump, abandoning the rigid posture I had held since he dragged me into this room. I looked up at him, allowing my eyes to well with unshed tears, playing the exact role of the shattered bride he so desperately needed to see. "Brandon," I whispered, my voice intentionally fragile and thick with manufactured panic. "You are asking me to sign away 6 years of my life. You are asking me to walk away from everything we built together. This document is 30 pages long. It is filled with non-compete clauses and liability waivers. I cannot just sign this blindly. If I sign this right now, I am surrendering my entire career. Please, I just need 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes to read what I am actually agreeing to. Let me process the fact that my life is over." Brandon scoffed, a short, arrogant sound that echoed in the quiet bridal lounge. He looked at me with profound disgust, completely buying into my performance. His ego was so massive, so fragile, that he could not fathom a reality where I was outsmarting him. He believed my plea for time was just a pathetic attempt to delay the inevitable. "You always have to read every single line, do you not?" he sneered, checking the gold watch on his wrist. "Fine. You have 5 minutes, Chloe. Read your little contract. Cry over your lost empire. But when I walk back through that door, you will have your signature on that paper, or I will personally drag you out of this building and ensure you never work in corporate finance again." He turned on his heel, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the plush pink carpet. He grabbed the heavy oak door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, and I heard the unmistakable sound of the lock turning from the outside. The second the latch clicked, the trembling in my hands vanished. The fake tears dried instantly. My posture straightened, and the cold, calculating executive returned. I dropped the heavy gold pen onto the vanity. I did not even glance at his ridiculous non-disclosure agreement. I did not need to read it. I already knew it was completely worthless. I moved quickly and silently across the room toward my overnight bag resting in the corner. Brandon thought he had disarmed me by confiscating my primary smartphone. He thought he had severed my connection to the Sterling Industries network by manually locking my administrative credentials. But he had fundamentally underestimated the woman he was dealing with. You do not manage the finances of a multi-million-dollar manufacturing firm completely balancing the books around an embezzling heir without learning how to build a back door. I unzipped the side compartment of my leather overnight bag and reached deep into the lining. My fingers closed around a sleek, black, untraceable backup smartphone. I had purchased this device 3 months ago with cash, paying for a secure, encrypted data plan that was completely invisible to the corporate cellular network. As Brandon's behavior had grown increasingly erratic over the past few weeks, pushing for a rushed wedding and aggressively hovering around his sick father, my internal alarms had gone off. I had sensed a massive shift in his strategy. I knew a storm was coming, even if I did not know the exact shape it would take. So I prepared. Every single night after Brandon fell asleep, believing he had successfully manipulated his devoted fiancée, I had been working. I had bypassed our company's standard firewall and established a secure encrypted shadow server. Every piece of financial data, every shadow mortgage document he had signed, every offshore crypto transfer he had initiated, and every fraudulent tax return he had forced me to legally maneuver around was mirrored onto that server. The server was inaccessible from the main office grid. It required a specific alphanumeric key and a biometric verification to unlock, and it was entirely controlled by the device currently resting in the palm of my hand. I unlocked the backup phone. The screen illuminated the dim corner of the bridal lounge. I opened the encrypted mail client I had customized specifically for this exact nightmare scenario. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with practiced precision. I did not need to search for the files. I had already compiled them into a single, comprehensive, undeniably damning portfolio. The portfolio contained the bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawal of $2.4 million from the employee pension fund. It contained the fraudulent deeds he had used to leverage the manufacturing plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And most importantly, it contained the digital footprint connecting Brandon directly to the predatory executives at Vulture Capital, proving his intent to liquidate his father's life work for personal gain. I attached the massive encrypted file to a new message. I did not type out a long emotional explanation. The numbers spoke for themselves. The numbers always spoke the absolute truth. I entered a single, highly classified email address into the recipient line. It was an address that did not belong to anyone in the Sterling Industries corporate structure. It did not belong to human resources, or the board of directors, or the local authorities. It belonged to the one man who had the power to stop this hostile takeover dead in its tracks. I pressed send. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen confirming the data transfer was complete. The payload had been delivered. The evidence of Brandon's ultimate betrayal was now completely out of his reach and in the hands of the one person he feared most. I locked the phone, slipped it back into the hidden compartment of my bag, and walked back over to the lighted vanity. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, taking a deep breath to steady the adrenaline rushing through my chest. As I stared into my own eyes, the lavish surroundings of the country club melted away, replaced by the sterile beeping environment of a hospital cardiac ward. 2 weeks ago, the world had been a very different place. Richard Sterling, the founder of the company, and the man I respected more than my own late father, had collapsed in his office. The ambulance had rushed him to the intensive care unit. The doctors had stabilized his heart, but the underlying diagnosis was grim. I remembered walking down the sterile white hallway of the hospital, my heels clicking softly against the linoleum floor. Brandon had been downstairs in the cafeteria, loudly complaining on his phone about how the hospital visit was interfering with his golf schedule. He had no idea I was walking into his father's private suite. Richard had specifically asked the nursing staff to call me, not his wife Susan, not his daughter Jessica, and certainly not his son Brandon. He wanted the chief financial officer. He wanted the woman who actually understood the blood and sweat required to build an empire from a single warehouse. I had stepped into the dimly lit room. Richard looked incredibly frail against the white hospital sheets. His skin was pale and a network of tubes and wires connected him to the monitoring machines. But his eyes, sharp and intelligent, were exactly the same. He had pointed a trembling finger toward the plastic chair beside his bed, instructing me to sit. "Chloe," Richard had said, his voice a raspy whisper that carried immense weight. "The doctors gave me the final timeline today. I have stage 4 heart failure. My body is shutting down. I have maybe 6 months left if I am careful." I had reached out and taken his weathered hand, fighting back the tears. Richard had been a mentor to me. He had seen my potential when I was just a junior accountant, and he had trusted me with the financial keys to his kingdom. I tried to offer words of comfort, but he squeezed my hand tightly, cutting me off. "We do not have time for pleasantries, Chloe," he had whispered, his grip surprisingly strong. "I am a dying man, and a dying man needs the absolute truth. I have spent my entire life building Sterling Industries. I employ over 400 people who rely on me to feed their families and pay their mortgages. I cannot leave this world blindly. He had looked deep into my eyes, searching for the loyalty he knew I possessed. Brandon has been pushing me to sign over the executive power, Richard had continued. He brought the final transition documents to the hospital this morning. He says he wants to take the burden off my shoulders so I can rest. He says he is ready to lead. But you and I both know my son Chloe. He is charming, he is persuasive, and he is entirely hollow. Richard had taken a slow, ragged breath before asking the question that changed everything. Tell me the truth about the company finances, Chloe. Tell me what my son has actually been doing behind my back. I know you have been protecting him. I know you have been protecting the family name. But if I hand him the keys to this company today, what will happen tomorrow? I had sat in that plastic chair listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. For 6 years I had lied to this man. I had buried his son's gambling debts, hidden the massive operational losses, and manipulated the cash flow to ensure Richard never knew what a failure Brandon truly was. I did it because I thought I was protecting the man I loved. And I did it because I thought I was protecting a father from a broken heart. But looking at Richard in that moment, facing his own mortality, and desperate to secure his legacy, I knew I could not lie to him anymore. The truth was going to break his heart, but keeping the secret was going to destroy hundreds of innocent lives. I took a deep breath, looked my mentor in the eye, and confessed everything. I told him about the missing funds. I told him about the erratic investments. I told him how I had personally deferred my own compensation to cover the payroll shortages Brandon had caused. I laid out the entire miserable reality of his son's absolute incompetence. I expected Richard to yell. I expected him to deny it, to accuse me of lying to defend his golden child, the way Susan and Jessica always did. Instead, a profound and heavy sadness washed over his face. He closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his cheek, disappearing into his oxygen mask. I knew, Richard had whispered, his voice cracking with quiet devastation. I think a part of me always knew he was empty. I just did not want to believe he was actively malicious. We sat in silence for a long time. The weight of the truth settled over the hospital room. Then Richard opened his eyes, and the sorrow was replaced by the fierce, brilliant determination of a man who had built a fortune from nothing. He was not a victim, and he was not going to let his son destroy his life's work. We are going to set a trap, Richard had said, his voice suddenly clear and commanding. We are going to let Brandon believe he has won. I will sign the preliminary transition documents. I will let him think he is taking over the company. But we are going to build a failsafe, Chloe. We are going to restructure the entire legal foundation of Sterling Industries, and we are going to do it completely in the dark. The memory faded, bringing me back to the present moment in the plush, perfumed bridal lounge. I looked down at my hands. The data transfer was complete. The encrypted email containing the final undeniable proof of Brandon's ultimate betrayal with Vulture Capital had just landed securely in the inbox of William Hayes, Richard Sterling's personal corporate attorney. Brandon thought this wedding was his masterpiece. He thought he had orchestrated a brilliant, dramatic public firing to dispose of the one woman who could stop his hostile takeover. He believed that his father was currently resting peacefully at his estate, completely unaware of the massacre happening at the country club. He did not know that his father was awake. He did not know that his father had been awake for 2 weeks. Brandon had just walked directly into the snare we had meticulously laid for him. By firing me publicly, by attempting to force me into signing a fraudulent non-disclosure agreement, and by confirming his intent to liquidate the assets to a private equity firm, Brandon had just triggered the catastrophic failsafe we had built into the corporate bylaws. I reached up and smoothed my dark hair. I adjusted the bodice of my custom silk gown. I did not look like a weeping, discarded bride. I looked like a chief financial officer preparing to execute a hostile takeover of my own. I heard the heavy footsteps approaching the oak door from the hallway. The handle rattled, and the lock clicked open. Brandon stepped back into the room, checking his gold watch, radiating that same toxic arrogance. Your 5 minutes are up, Chloe, he demanded, holding his hand out toward the glass vanity. Hand over the signed contract. I turned to face him, leaving the blank, unsigned document resting exactly where he had dropped it. I offered him a small, perfectly calm smile. The kind of smile an auditor gives right before they dismantle your entire life. I think we should go back out to the reception. I said, stepping past him toward the open door. "We have some very important guests arriving, and I would hate for you to miss your own wedding gift." The walk back to the main banquet hall felt like navigating a long and suffocating tunnel. Brandon kept his grip firmly on my elbow, his fingers digging into my skin through the silk of my dress. He marched me down the carpeted corridors of the country club, radiating a toxic, frantic energy. He was no longer the charming groom who had stood at the altar. He was a cornered animal trying to control a narrative that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. He needed this public spectacle wrapped up perfectly tied with a neat little bow so his high society friends and his corporate investors would not ask any difficult questions. "Listen to me very carefully," Brandon hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as we approached the grand double doors of the reception hall. "You are going to walk up to the center stage. You are going to take the microphone from the band leader, and you are going to tell all 300 of those people that you are stepping down voluntarily. You will tell them that the pressure of the chief financial officer position was simply too much for you to handle. You will say that you realized you were not cut out for the Sterling family legacy, and that we have decided to part ways amicably." I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, my face a mask of absolute calm. I did not try to pull my arm away. I let him believe he was physically and emotionally maneuvering me exactly where he wanted me to go. "You are going to smile," he continued, his grip tightening as we reached the entrance. "You will apologize to my mother and my sister for wasting their time today. You will preserve the honor of this family. If you deviate from that script by even a single syllable, I will absolutely ruin you. I will make sure you are sued into bankruptcy for corporate espionage before the sun sets on Monday. Do you understand me?" "I understand exactly who you are," I replied softly. He took that as a submission. He pushed the heavy doors open, steering me into the sprawling, opulent space. The banquet hall was a masterpiece of excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over dozens of round tables, draped in imported ivory linen. Massive ice sculptures glittered in the corners, and an extravagant, multi-tiered wedding cake sat untouched near the dance floor. The 300 guests who had witnessed my humiliation on the lawn had been ushered inside for the cocktail hour. The room was buzzing with a low, nervous hum of gossip. The moment we stepped through the doors, the whispering stopped entirely. 300 pairs of eyes instantly locked onto us. The silence was heavy and thick with morbid curiosity. These were the elite brokers, investors, and socialites of Connecticut. They were watching a train wreck unfold in real time, and they were eager to see the final casualty. I spotted Susan and Jessica sitting at the head table. Brandon's mother was elegantly sipping a glass of champagne, her posture perfectly relaxed. Jessica was leaning over, whispering something into her mother's ear that made them both smirk. They looked entirely satisfied, completely convinced that the working-class accountant had finally been put in her rightful place. They thought the show was over. They thought the Sterling family had won. Brandon let go of my arm and gave me a slight, forceful shove toward the stage, where the jazz band was standing awkwardly holding their instruments. "Go," he commanded under his breath. "Say the words. Save whatever is left of your dignity." I walked toward the stage. My custom silk gown rustled softly against the polished hardwood floor. I took my time. I did not rush. I climbed the 3 short steps to the platform. The band leader, a kind-looking older man who seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation, hesitantly handed me the microphone. His hand was shaking slightly. Mine was perfectly steady. I turned to face the massive crowd. I looked out over the sea of designer suits and expensive evening gowns. I saw the faces of suppliers I had personally negotiated with to keep our supply chain moving. I saw the faces of board members whose quarterly dividends I had painstakingly protected. And right in the front row, I saw Brandon. He was standing with his arms crossed over his chest, his chin tilted up in supreme arrogance, waiting for my public surrender. I raised the microphone. I took a slow, deep breath, buying time. I was not afraid. I was simply counting the seconds. I knew that my encrypted email had already been delivered. I knew that the wheels of justice had already been set into motion. I just needed to hold the room's attention for a few more moments. Before I could speak a single word, a sound echoed from the back of the banquet hall. It was the loud, unmistakable crash of the heavy mahogany doors being thrown open. The sound was so forceful that it startled several guests in the back rows, causing them to jump and spill their drinks. The heavy wood slammed against the wall stops with a violent thud that reverberated through the entire room. Every single head in the banquet hall, including Brandon's, whipped around toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright hallway lights, was Richard Sterling. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Richard Sterling was the founder of Sterling Industries. He was a titan of the local business community, a man who commanded absolute respect. But more importantly, everyone in this room knew that Richard was supposed to be confined to an intensive care unit at the city hospital, fighting a losing battle against stage 4 heart failure. He did not look like a man who was dying. He did not look weak or frail or defeated. He stood tall and rigid, his broad shoulders squared, wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit. His face, usually warm and welcoming to his friends and colleagues, was set into a mask of pure, terrifying wrath. The sheer force of his presence seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He was not a sick old man today. He was a furious king returning to a castle that had been invaded, and he was not alone. Walking right beside him, matching his purposeful stride, was William Hayes. Everyone in the corporate sector recognized William Hayes. He was the most notoriously aggressive corporate litigator in the entire state of Connecticut. He was a man you only hired when you intended to completely dismantle someone's life. William was carrying a thick black leather briefcase, his expression as cold and unreadable as carved granite. The guests parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to speak. The elite crowd shuffled backward, bumping into tables and chairs to clear a wide path down the center aisle of the banquet hall. Richard and William walked forward with measured, deliberate steps. I looked over at the head table. Susan had frozen completely. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, spilling expensive wine across her silver dress. She did not even notice. She was staring at her husband as if she had just seen a ghost. Jessica had covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sudden, unexplainable panic. They had built their entire day around the assumption that Richard was completely incapacitated. Seeing him marching toward them was tearing their reality apart. Brandon, however, was blinded by his own staggering hubris. His initial shock quickly morphed into a twisted, delusional excitement. He genuinely believed that his father had somehow summoned the strength to leave his hospital bed, just to witness his son's ultimate victory. Brandon smoothed his tuxedo jacket, puffing his chest out. He stepped away from the stage and walked confidently down the center aisle to meet his father halfway. Dad, Brandon called out, his voice loud and booming, trying to project the image of a devoted and victorious son. "You should not be out of bed. The doctors said you needed absolute rest, but since you are here, I am so glad you made it." Richard did not slow his pace. He kept walking toward his son. His eyes locked onto Brandon with a chilling intensity. William Hayes walked silently a half step behind him. "I handled it." "Dad," Brandon boasted, opening his arms wide as if expecting an embrace. He gestured back toward me, standing on the stage holding the microphone. "I took care of the dead weight. I fired her. I secured the transition of power, just like we talked about. I am taking full control of Sterling Industries today, and I am protecting our family legacy. You do not have to worry about a single thing anymore. I have cleared all the obstacles." Brandon stopped walking, waiting for the praise. He waited for his father to pat him on the back, to tell him how proud he was, to validate his ruthless behavior in front of 300 important guests. Richard stopped exactly 2 feet in front of his son. The entire banquet hall held its collective breath. You could hear the faint, ambient hum of the air conditioning unit. Richard looked at Brandon. He looked at the arrogant smile on his son's face, the expensive tuxedo, bought with stolen money, the absolute lack of remorse for the destruction he was causing. The disappointment in Richard's eyes was so profound, it was almost difficult to witness. It was the look of a father realizing that the child he had raised was entirely devoid of a moral compass. Without saying a single word, Richard raised his right hand. He did not hesitate. He swung his arm with a sudden explosive force that defied his medical condition. The palm of his hand connected with Brandon's cheek with a sickening sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The physical impact was massive. Brandon's head snapped violently to the side. He stumbled backward, completely losing his footing on the polished hardwood floor. He crashed into a nearby guest table, knocking over a centerpiece of white orchids, and sending silverware clattering loudly to the ground. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling completely to the floor, his hand flying up to cover his rapidly reddening cheek. Several guests let out muffled cries of shock. A few people physically turned their faces away. At the head table, Susan screamed her husband's name, a shrill, hysterical sound that pierced the tension, but she did not dare approach him. Brandon slowly raised his head, his eyes wide with absolute shock and utter confusion. He stared at his father, his chest heaving completely, unable to process what had just happened. The golden boy, the untouchable heir, who had never faced a single consequence in his 33 years of life, had just been publicly struck down in the middle of his own twisted victory parade. "What is wrong with you?" Brandon stammered, his voice trembling, stripped of all its previous arrogance. "Dad, I am protecting the company. I am protecting you." "You are a parasite," Richard said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deadly, resonant authority that filled every corner of the room. It was the voice of a man who had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. "You are not protecting my company." Richard continued, taking a slow step toward his trembling son. "You are selling my life's work to corporate scavengers to cover your own pathetic gambling debts. You are attempting to destroy the career of the only person who actually kept you out of a federal prison. You have disgraced my name. You have disgraced this family, and you are entirely finished." Brandon's face drained of all color. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The secret was out. The grand illusion was shattered. He looked frantically at William Hayes, then back to his father, and finally his eyes sought me out on the stage. He realized in that agonizing moment that I had not been defeated in the bridal lounge. I had been stalling him while I armed the missile that was currently destroying his world. The power dynamic in the room inverted completely. The 300 guests who had watched me being humiliated just minutes ago were now staring at Brandon with open disgust. The murmurs started again this time, harsh and judgmental. The business partners Brandon had tried to impress were already physically backing away from him, distancing themselves from a sinking ship. I stood on the stage, the microphone still in my hand, watching the man who had tried to break me crumble under the weight of his own hubris. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched as the fortress of lies he had built collapsed into dust. Richard Sterling had arrived, and the reckoning had officially begun. The stinging echo of the slap lingered in the cavernous banquet hall. It hung in the air above the crystal centerpieces and the imported ivory linens, a sharp and violent sound that completely shattered the carefully curated illusion of the Sterling family. Brandon stood frozen with his hand pressed against his rapidly swelling cheek. His chest heaved with shallow and panicked breaths. The golden boy of Connecticut high society had just been publicly struck down by the very man he thought he had successfully manipulated. Richard Sterling did not look at his son with anger anymore. The initial burst of wrath had burned away, leaving behind a cold and profound sorrow. It was the devastating realization of a father who finally understood that the child he had raised was a predator. Richard slowly turned away from Brandon, dismissing him entirely, and gave a brief but firm nod to William Hayes. The notorious corporate attorney did not hesitate. William bypassed the bewildered wedding guests and walked with measured precision directly toward the audiovisual control booth positioned at the far edge of the room. The young technician sitting behind the mixing board looked absolutely terrified as the imposing lawyer approached him. William opened his pristine leather briefcase, retrieved a small silver flash drive, and handed it to the technician. He leaned down and spoke a few quiet words. The technician swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he plugged the drive into the main console. Behind the grand stage where I was still standing, the massive motorized projector screen began to lower from the ceiling. It descended with a soft mechanical hum that sounded unnervingly loud in the dead silent room. This giant screen had been specifically requested by Susan. Just an hour ago, it was supposed to display a meticulously edited cinematic video of our supposed love story. It was meant to showcase perfectly filtered photographs of Brandon and me, smiling on sailboats, posing at charity galas, and looking like the ultimate power couple. Susan had spent thousands of dollars on a production company to ensure her son looked like a flawless romantic hero to the 300 elite guests in attendance. But as the heavy canvas locked into place and the powerful projector flared to life, there were no romantic photographs. There was no soft acoustic music playing in the background. Instead, the enormous screen was illuminated with stark, blindingly bright financial spreadsheets. A collective murmur of confusion swept through the ballroom. 300 guests leaned forward in their velvet chairs, squinting at the glaring white background and the endless rows of black numbers. To the untrained eye, it looked like a boring administrative presentation. But to the bankers, the investors, and the business partners seated in the front rows, it was a terrifyingly clear picture of corporate treason. William Hayes stepped up to the stage. He did not ask for permission. He simply took the microphone from my hand. He offered me a brief look of profound respect before turning to face the bewildered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," William began, his voice projecting a surgical and absolute authority. "You were invited here today to celebrate a union and a transition of power. But Richard Sterling believes that transparency is the foundation of any successful enterprise. Therefore, he feels it is his duty to share the true financial state of Sterling Industries before any transition can be legally finalized." William raised a small remote control and clicked a button. The spreadsheet on the massive screen zoomed in, highlighting a specific column of numbers in a glaring, undeniable red. "What you are looking at is a detailed ledger of the Sterling Industries Employee Retirement Pension Fund," William announced. "For the past 40 years, Richard Sterling has personally guaranteed the retirement savings of the 400 machinists, floor managers, and administrative staff who built this company with their bare hands. It is a sacred trust." William clicked the remote again. A new document flashed onto the screen. It was a wire transfer authorization form. The signature at the bottom belonged unmistakably to Brandon Sterling. "As of this morning," William continued, his voice echoing like a judge delivering a sentence, "the internal audits confirmed that exactly $2,400,000 has been unlawfully drained from the employee pension fund. Those funds were not reinvested into the company. They were not used to upgrade our manufacturing facilities. They were systematically siphoned through a dummy corporation and funneled directly into high-risk offshore cryptocurrency accounts and speculative stock portfolios." The silence in the room fractured into 1,000 terrified whispers. The older employees seated in the back of the room, the men and women who had dedicated decades of their lives to the assembly lines, gasped out loud. Their life savings, their security for their twilight years, had been stolen to fund the lavish lifestyle of an entitled heir. Brandon tried to speak. He dropped his hand from his bruised cheek and took a desperate step toward the stage. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of the public exposure. "Those documents are fake." She hacked the system. Chloe manipulated the ledgers to frame me because she knew I was going to fire her. He pointed an accusatory finger at me, but his hand was shaking so violently he looked completely unhinged. No one believed him. The evidence was too overwhelming, too meticulously detailed to be a sudden fabrication. Richard Sterling walked slowly to the front of the stage. He did not need a microphone to command the room. His voice was thick with emotion, but it never wavered. "Chloe did not frame you, Brandon," Richard said, looking down at his son with absolute disgust. "Chloe spent the last 6 years working 70 hours a week to cover up your staggering incompetence. She sacrificed her youth and her health to keep this company afloat while you drained it from the inside out. I knew you were reckless. I knew you were greedy. But I never wanted to believe that my own flesh and blood would steal from the very people who put food on our table." Richard turned to address the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of his lifelong friends and business partners. 2 weeks ago, when I was lying in a hospital bed facing my own mortality, Chloe finally told me the truth. Richard confessed to the room. She showed me the initial discrepancies. She warned me that Brandon was trying to expedite my retirement so he could bury his crimes permanently. But we needed undeniable proof. We needed to know exactly how deep the rot had spread. So we let him believe he was winning. We let him think he had outsmarted us all. Richard pointed to the giant screen. William Hayes clicked the remote one final time. A new email thread appeared. It was the exact encrypted message I had sent from the bridal lounge just minutes ago. The logo of Vulture Capital was displayed prominently at the top of the correspondence. While Brandon was busy parading around this country club, firing the only woman who ever truly tried to save him, Chloe was downloading the final pieces of the puzzle, Richard explained, his voice swelling with a fierce and protective pride. That email proves that my son was not just stealing from the pension fund. He had already signed a preliminary agreement to sell Sterling Industries to Vulture Capital. He was going to liquidate the manufacturing plants, fire every single employee without severance, and walk away with a personal payout to cover his debts. He was going to burn my life's work to the ground. The revelation hit the banquet hall like an explosive detonation. The investors in the front row began pulling out their phones, frantically typing messages to their respective financial firms. The business partners who had shaken Brandon's hand an hour ago were now staring at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. He was suddenly radioactive. At the head table, the reality of the situation finally pierced through Susan's thick armor of denial and entitlement. The matriarch of the Sterling family could no longer pretend this was just a minor misunderstanding. The numbers on the screen were a death sentence for her social standing. The women she played tennis with, the charity board members she constantly tried to impress, they were all sitting in this room watching her son be exposed as a common thief. Her carefully constructed universe of wealth and privilege was collapsing right in front of her eyes. Susan shot up from her chair. The expensive silver fabric of her gown caught on the edge of the table, pulling an elaborate floral arrangement crashing to the floor. She did not care. She marched toward the audiovisual booth, her face contorted into a mask of absolute hysterical panic. "Turn that off!" Susan shrieked, her voice cracking in a thoroughly undignified wail. "Turn that screen off right this second. This is a private family matter. You have no right to display our business like this. This is an outrage." She reached the booth and actually slammed her hands down on the mixing console, trying to physically rip the silver flash drive from the computer port. The young technician scrambled backward in his rolling chair, terrified of the screaming woman in the silver dress. Jessica was right behind her mother. The sister who had so happily mocked me on the lawn was now hyperventilating. Her luxurious lifestyle, her boutique fitness studio, her endless shopping sprees, they were all funded by the company her brother had just tried to destroy. The money was gone. The trust fund was evaporated. "This is all a setup," Jessica screamed, pointing wildly at me on the stage. "She is a gold-digging liar. She fabricated those emails. She is just trying to steal our money because Brandon finally dumped her. Somebody call the police and have her arrested for corporate espionage." Her shrill, desperate accusations bounced off the walls, but they carried no weight. The truth was written in black and white on a screen that was 20 feet tall. No amount of screaming could erase the routing numbers. No amount of social privilege could undo the digital footprint of a massive financial crime. Susan was sobbing now, gripping the edge of the audiovisual table. "Richard, please," she begged, looking at her husband with wild, tear-filled eyes. "You are ruining us. You are ruining our son. Think of the family name. Think of the scandal. We can fix this quietly. We can pay the money back. Just turn the screen off and let these people go home." Richard Sterling looked at his wife of 35 years. He looked at the woman who had enabled their son's worst impulses, the woman who had treated me like disposable garbage because I did not come from the right neighborhood. His expression was harder than diamonds. "The family name was ruined the moment he decided to steal the retirement savings of men and women who trusted me," Richard said, his voice echoing through the microphone William Hayes held up for him. "There is no fixing this quietly, Susan. The time for hiding our shameful secrets is over. The poison has to be dragged out into the light, or it will kill everything I have built." Brandon was pacing in a tight circle near the front of the stage. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo clinging to his back. He looked like a cornered rat looking for a crack in the wall to squeeze through. He realized that the social elite in this room would never do business with him again. He realized that the Vulture Capital deal was entirely dead. He realized he was completely out of options. "I am leaving," Brandon announced, his voice shaking with a pathetic attempt at bravado. He tugged at the lapels of his jacket, trying to salvage a microscopic shred of dignity. "I do not have to stand here and be subjected to a kangaroo court. You can talk to my lawyers on Monday." He turned on his heel and began marching toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the banquet hall. Susan and Jessica immediately abandoned the audiovisual booth and hurried after him, eager to escape the suffocating judgment of the 300 people staring at them. They wanted to run back to their sprawling estate, lock the gates, and pretend the world outside did not exist. But Richard Sterling was not finished. He had not orchestrated this massive public reckoning just to let the guilty parties walk away into the afternoon sun. He had brought them here to face the absolute and unavoidable consequences of their actions. Richard raised his hand and pointed toward the back of the room. His voice was a booming command that stopped Brandon dead in his tracks. "Lock the doors," Richard ordered. The two massive private security guards, the exact same men who had physically dragged me off the wedding altar at Susan's command, immediately stepped in front of the mahogany doors. They crossed their thick arms over their chests, forming an impenetrable human barricade. Brandon stopped just 3 feet away from them, realizing with a sickening jolt that the men his mother had hired were now taking their orders directly from his father. "Nobody leaves this room," Richard declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You wanted a public spectacle today, Brandon. You wanted to stand in front of 300 people and destroy an innocent woman to protect your pride. Well, you are going to stay right here, and you are going to watch exactly how a real transition of power happens." The trap had completely closed. There was no escape. The golden boy, the enabling mother, and the arrogant sister were sealed inside the banquet hall, surrounded by the undeniable evidence of their own destruction. They were forced to stand under the glaring light of the projector screen, exposed, humiliated, and utterly powerless. I stood on the stage looking down at the people who had made my life a living nightmare for 6 years. My heart was completely steady. My mind was perfectly clear. I had survived the fire, and now I was going to watch them burn. The heavy thud of the mahogany doors sealing shut reverberated through the opulent banquet hall like the final slam of a judge's gavel. The two massive security guards crossed their arms, transforming instantly from hired wedding staff into an impenetrable human barricade. I stood on the stage, the microphone resting coldly in my hand, and watched the blood that had drained from Brandon's face come rushing back in a violent crimson flush of pure, unadulterated rage. He was a cornered animal, suddenly realizing the cage was locked, and cornered animals do not surrender quietly. They bare their teeth, and they fight to the bitter end. Brandon turned away from the guards and spun back to face his father. His chest was heaving under his meticulously tailored tuxedo. The charming, untouchable groom persona he had worn all afternoon melted away completely, leaving behind a frantic, desperate man who refused to accept his own defeat. He looked at the giant projector screen, still glowing with the damning evidence of his embezzlement, and then he looked out at the 300 elite guests who were staring at him in absolute silence. He decided in that moment to double down on his delusions. "You think locking the doors changes a single thing about reality?" Brandon shouted, his voice cracking with a frantic, aggressive energy. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his father's chest. "You think putting on a theatrical show for your country club friends is going to stop me? You are a sick, weak old man living in the past. You do not have the physical stamina or the corporate vision to keep Sterling Industries alive in the modern economy, and you certainly do not have the legal authority to stop me from saving it my way." Brandon reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, waving the device in the air like a weapon he could use to fend off the inevitable. "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation," he declared, his voice echoing fiercely off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "I am the legally appointed head of this family business. You signed the paperwork yourself. Last Tuesday, while you were lying in your hospital bed complaining about your legacy, you signed the comprehensive power of attorney. You initiated the transfer of the controlling shares into my personal name. You authorized me to act with absolute executive discretion across all our financial platforms. That transition is legally binding. It was notarized, filed, and processed by your own corporate management team." He paced back and forth in front of the massive screen, aggressively ignoring the spreadsheet that documented his massive theft from the employee pension fund. He looked out at the silent, staring crowd of investors and business partners actively trying to rally them to his side. He wanted to convince them that his betrayal was actually a stroke of financial genius. "This is capitalism," Brandon yelled, addressing the bewildered guests with a wild look in his eyes. "You all know exactly how this works. I made a strategic executive decision. Vulture Capital offered a premium buyout that will secure our financial future for generations. I have every legal right to execute that sale. I own the shares. I hold the executive pen. This little performance you orchestrated with my bitter ex-fiancé changes absolutely nothing. You can slap me in public. You can humiliate my mother. You can lock us in this room. But tomorrow morning, the ink dries on that acquisition, and there is not a single thing any of you can do to stop me." He stood breathless in the center of the room, his chin jutting out in supreme defiance. He truly believed he was untouchable. He believed that the thick stacks of legal paper he had forced his ailing father to sign last week were an impenetrable shield that would protect him from the consequences of his own greed. I watched him from the stage marveling at the sheer magnitude of his arrogance. He had spent his entire life treating people like disposable assets, and he assumed the law would treat him exactly the same way, bending to his will, simply because he demanded it. Richard Sterling did not scream back. He did not need to match his son's frantic volume, or engage in a shouting match in front of his esteemed colleagues. He simply took a slow, deliberate step to the side, yielding the center of the room to the man standing quietly behind him. William Hayes stepped forward. The notorious corporate litigator moved with the calm, predatory grace of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. He wore a charcoal suit that looked as sharp as his reputation. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He simply unclasped the brass latches of his pristine leather briefcase, reached inside, and retrieved a single thick manila folder. Mr. Sterling William began addressing Brandon directly. His voice was incredibly smooth, yet it carried a razor-sharp edge that sliced effortlessly through the lingering tension in the ballroom. It is always absolutely fascinating to listen to an individual lecture a room full of seasoned executives about the complex mechanics of corporate law when that individual clearly has not bothered to read his own company bylaws. Brandon stopped pacing. He glared at the lawyer, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I know what I signed," he spat vehemently. "I know my legal rights. I had my own attorneys review every single page of that transition agreement." "You know what you thought you signed," William corrected, gently adjusting his glasses as he opened the folder in his hands. "You are correct about one very specific detail. Last Tuesday, your father did sign a durable power of attorney, granting you the ability to make administrative decisions on his behalf while he was medically incapacitated. He also initiated a preliminary transfer of executive shares to your name, pending a standard 30-day legal review period." Brandon smirked, casting a triumphant glance toward the head table where his mother sat. Susan had stopped sobbing long enough to listen to the legal validation she so desperately craved. She straightened her posture visibly, clutching onto the hope that her son had actually outsmarted his father. However, William continued completely unfazed by the groom's arrogant display. "A power of attorney is fundamentally a fiduciary instrument. In the state of Connecticut, as in all legal jurisdictions across this country, a fiduciary is strictly obligated to act exclusively in the best financial interest of the principal. The exact moment you utilized that administrative authority to secure shadow mortgages against the company's primary manufacturing plants to fund your private, highly speculative cryptocurrency ventures, you breached your fiduciary duty in a catastrophic and blatantly criminal manner." William pulled a crisp, heavily stamped document from the folder and held it up for the entire room to see. The state seal gleamed in the light of the chandeliers. Furthermore, a power of attorney can be revoked by the principal at any time, provided the principal is of sound mind, William explained, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. "When Chloe presented your father with the undeniable proof of your embezzlement 2 weeks ago, we did not just sit idle. We brought in a highly respected independent medical board to evaluate Richard's cognitive capacity. They certified him as completely lucid and fully capable of making executive decisions. And late last night, after we intercepted your final email, confirming your intent to liquidate the company to Vulture Capital, Richard officially and irrevocably revoked your power of attorney." Brandon blinked, the aggressive defiance faltering for the first time since the doors had locked. "That document was filed with the state registry at exactly 8 o'clock this morning," William stated, tossing the paper onto a nearby dining table. "Your legal authority to act on behalf of Sterling Industries evaporated before you even put on that tuxedo today. You have no power to sell anything. The deal with Vulture Capital is completely dead." The smirk vanished entirely from Brandon's face. The color drained from his cheeks once more, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth to argue, but only a pathetic, breathless sound came out. The realization that his ironclad legal shield had been dismantled overnight was physically staggering. But the shares, Susan suddenly cried out from the head table. Her voice was shrill and trembling with renewed panic. She stood up, knocking her chair backward onto the floor. The shares are already in his name. You cannot just take back ownership of a multi-million-dollar company once the transition papers are filed. He is the majority shareholder. He still owns the company. William turned his cold, calculating gaze toward Brandon's mother. He looked at her with the weary patience of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a very slow student. That would be entirely true, madam, if this were a standard corporate transition, William said. But Sterling Industries is not a standard corporation. When Richard founded this company 40 years ago, he drafted the original corporate bylaws with a very specific, ironclad contingency. It is a provision known as an Emergency Asset Protection Clause designed exclusively to prevent hostile internal takeovers and gross financial mismanagement. William turned his attention back to the trembling groom. He stepped closer, ensuring that every word he spoke landed with maximum impact. Clause Section 4, Paragraph 12 of your company bylaws. William recited entirely from memory, never breaking eye contact with Brandon. It states explicitly that if any acting executive or majority shareholder is found to be engaged in fraud, embezzlement, or any action that directly threatens the survival of the corporation, the founder retains the absolute unilateral right to freeze all pending share transfers, seize immediate control of the compromised assets, and automatically remove the offending party from the board of directors without requiring a majority vote. Brandon stumbled backward, his knees practically buckling under the overwhelming weight of the legal reality crushing down on him. He reached out blindly and grabbed the edge of a velvet chair to steady himself. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The brilliant exit strategy he had plotted for months was dissolving into dust right before his eyes. You triggered that emergency succession clause the moment you wired employee pension funds into an offshore account, William stated, closing the manila folder with a sharp echoing snap that made Jessica flinch at the head table. Your father did not need to negotiate with you. He did not need to buy out your shares or take you to civil court to reclaim his company. He simply exercised his foundational right to protect his lifelong legacy from a thief. William stepped aside, allowing Richard to once again take the center of the floor. The older man looked at his son with a mixture of pity and resolute strength. You do not own Sterling Industries, Brandon William concluded, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. You do not have a seat on the board. You are not the chief executive officer. You are completely stripped of all corporate titles and privileges. As of this morning, you are nothing more than a terminated employee who is currently facing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The room was completely paralyzed. The business partners and investors who had been whispering a few moments ago were now absolutely still absorbing the sheer magnitude of the legal takedown they had just witnessed. Brandon had tried to play a high-stakes game of corporate chess, but he had failed to realize that his father owned the board, the pieces, and the rulebook itself. I watched from the stage, gripping the microphone tightly in my hand. I felt a profound sense of validation wash over me. For years, I had watched Brandon operate with total impunity, believing that his last name protected him from the consequences of his actions. I had spent countless sleepless nights trying to untangle his financial messes, always terrified that the company would collapse under the weight of his greed. Now the truth was out in the open. The illusion of the golden, untouchable heir had been shattered in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Brandon looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from face to face. He looked at his mother, who had collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. He looked at his sister, who was staring at him with a mixture of horror and betrayal, realizing that her endless stream of trust fund money was gone forever. And finally, he looked at his father. He was searching for a lifeline, a shred of the paternal leniency that had saved him so many times before. But there was no leniency left. Richard Sterling had drawn a permanent boundary, and he was not going to cross it to save a son who had tried to destroy everything he loved. Brandon had brought us all to this country club today to show the world how powerful he was. He had intended to break my spirit and celebrate his victory. Instead, he had provided the perfect stage for his own complete and total destruction. The legal illusion he had so carefully constructed was gone, leaving him completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. The heavy silence in the grand banquet hall was entirely different now. Just moments ago, the quiet had been thick with my public humiliation, a suffocating blanket woven from the pity and judgment of 300 elite guests. Now the silence was electric. It crackled with the undeniable energy of absolute justice. Brandon stood completely paralyzed in the center of the room, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. The corporate shield he thought he had forged had just been systematically dismantled by William Hayes, leaving the arrogant heir completely exposed. But the legal dismantling was only the beginning of his punishment. The true reckoning was about to be delivered by his own father. Richard Sterling stepped forward, leaving the formidable attorney a half step behind him. The founder of Sterling Industries moved with a quiet, undeniable gravity. He did not look at his terrified son. He did not spare a single glance for his weeping wife at the head table, or his pale, trembling daughter, who was shrinking into her silk chair. Instead, Richard turned his body entirely toward the stage where I was standing. He walked up the short wooden steps, moving slowly but with absolute purpose. He stopped right beside me. I looked into the eyes of the man I had spent 6 years trying to protect. Despite the pale tint of his skin and the toll his failing heart had taken on his body, his eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering clarity. He offered me a small, deeply respectful nod. It was the kind of acknowledgement that equals share after surviving a brutal war together. Richard reached his hand inside the breast pocket of his impeccably tailored dark vest. He withdrew a thick, crisp manila folder. It was not a standard corporate document. I immediately recognized the heavy texture of the paper and the gleaming embossed gold seal of the Connecticut Secretary of State stamped across the front cover. It was a finalized, legally binding state charter. He held the folder in his hands, tracing his thumb over the gold seal for a brief second, before turning to face the sprawling, silent crowd of investors, business partners, and socialites. For 40 years I have poured my blood, my sweat, and my very soul into building Sterling Industries. Richard began, his voice projecting across the ballroom with a rich, resonant power that required no microphone. I started in a drafty garage with a single manufacturing machine and a mountain of debt. I built an enterprise that provides vital medical equipment to thousands of families and puts food on the table for 400 loyal employees. I always believed that my greatest achievement would be passing that legacy down to my son. I believed that my bloodline would be the ultimate caretakers of the empire I created. Richard paused, casting a brief, chilling look down at Brandon, who was currently staring at his expensive leather shoes, completely unable to meet his father's gaze. But blood does not guarantee loyalty. Richard continued, his voice hardening into steel. Blood does not automatically instill character or integrity or competence. I spent the last 2 weeks lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life's work was going to end. I listened to my son tell me that he was ready to carry the torch. I listened to my wife tell me that our family was perfectly positioned for the future. And all the while, I was blind to the fact that the very people who shared my last name were actively driving a dagger into the heart of my company. A soft, collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The wealthy guests who had spent the last hour silently judging me were now forced to confront the absolute moral bankruptcy of the family they socialized with. Susan let out a muffled sob from the head table, burying her face in her napkin, completely unable to bear the public unmasking of her failures as a mother and an enabler. Richard turned his head and looked directly at me. The harshness in his expression melted away completely. The fierce, terrifying tycoon vanished, replaced by a mentor looking upon his greatest protege with profound admiration. But I was not entirely blind, Richard said, his voice softening so genuinely that it brought a sudden, sharp sting of tears to my eyes. Because while my own flesh and blood was busy mortgaging our factories to fund his gambling addictions, while my son was plotting to sell off the livelihoods of 400 families to corporate scavengers, there was one person standing in the breach. One person who worked 70 hours a week, who sacrificed her own well-being, and who tirelessly balanced the ledgers to keep the walls from caving in on us all. He stepped closer to me, holding the state-sealed folder out for the entire room to see. Chloe is not just an accountant. Richard declared, his voice rising in volume, demanding that every single person in the country club hear his next words. You have all sat here and watched my family mock her. You watched my son try to discard her like trash. You watched my daughter call her a gold digger. But Chloe is the only person in this room who actually knows the value of hard work. She is the only one who has been keeping the Sterling name untainted. She did not try to steal my fortune. She bled to save it. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Brandon looked up from the floor, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying realization. He was beginning to understand that his father was not just defending my honor. His father was setting the stage for a monumental shift in power. 2 weeks ago, Richard continued turning his fierce gaze back to the crowd. I realized that if I handed the keys of my kingdom to my son, there would be no kingdom left to inherit. So I made a different choice. I decided to give my life's work to the only person who has actually earned it. Richard opened the thick manila folder. He pulled out the heavy embossed state document. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Richard announced, his words falling like massive, unyielding stones into the quiet room. My attorney, William Hayes, finalized a sweeping corporate restructuring. I have officially completed the process of establishing a new private holding company. Through a rapid and fully authorized transfer of my foundational equity, this holding company has completely swallowed and taken over all assets, patents, and operational control of Sterling Industries. A wave of shocked whispers immediately broke out among the investors in the front row. They were all seasoned business veterans. They knew exactly what a holding company meant. They knew the sheer, undeniable finality of a foundational equity transfer. Richard had essentially built a legal fortress around his entire empire, locking his family completely out of the vault, and the sole manager of this new holding company, Richard said, raising his voice to cut through the rising murmurs. The holder of 51% of the absolute voting shares. He turned to me and gently placed the heavy gold-sealed document directly into my hands. Is Chloe, he finished. The words hit the banquet hall with the force of a localized earthquake. The shockwave was physical. You could see the realization rippling through the crowd as the brutal, undeniable math settled into their minds. 51%. Majority control. Absolute, unchallengeable, executive authority. I looked down at the document resting in my hands. The paper felt heavy, anchored by the gold seal of the state. I read the bold, black ink printed across the top of the charter. My name was right there, legally bound to the controlling interest of the empire I had spent 6 agonizing years trying to save. I was no longer an employee. I was no longer a victim. I was the undisputed owner of a multi-million-dollar corporation. Down on the floor, Brandon's entire reality violently collapsed in on itself. He stumbled backward, his mouth hanging open in a silent, horrific scream of absolute defeat. He looked at his father, then at the document in my hands, and finally up at my face. The gears in his mind were grinding and snapping as he desperately tried to calculate his way out of a trap that had no exit. He had stood on the sunlit lawn just an hour ago and gleefully fired me in front of 300 people. He had told the world that my services were no longer required. He had aggressively dragged me into a bridal lounge and tried to bully me into signing a $50,000 severance package, but he had no right to fire me. He never had the legal authority to terminate my employment. Because at 8 o'clock this morning, hours before he ever put on his wedding tuxedo, the corporate structure had shifted beneath his feet. I was not his employee. I was his boss. I was the new owner. I was the chairwoman of the board. I owned the factories he had tried to mortgage. I owned the patents he had tried to sell. I literally owned the desk he sat at.
Dad, no.
Brandon finally gasped out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You cannot do this! You cannot give our company to her. It belongs to us. It is my birthright. I am your son. You stopped being my son the day you decided to steal from the people who work for me. Richard fired back, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. You have no birthright here, Brandon. You have nothing. You tried to execute a hostile takeover of my company, but you were too busy playing dress-up at a country club to realize that your target had already acquired you. At the head table, the situation devolved into total chaotic despair. Susan let out a loud, terrifying shriek, clutching her chest as if she were having a physical heart attack. She slumped heavily over the table, her perfectly coiffed hair falling into a spilled plate of appetizers. Her entire identity, her wealth, her country club memberships, her sprawling estate, everything she valued in the world was now entirely dependent on the goodwill of the working-class girl she had relentlessly mocked and tormented for 6 years. Jessica was absolutely hysterical. She was crying so hard her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. She stood up, pointing frantically at the stage. She manipulated him. Jessica screamed to the horrified crowd. Do you not see what is happening? The gold digger finally got her hands on the money. She tricked a dying man into giving away his family fortune. Somebody do something. Somebody call the police. William Hayes stepped forward completely unbothered by the screaming woman. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Jessica. I would be very careful with your next words, Ms. Sterling. William advised smoothly, his tone carrying a lethal warning. As the newly appointed chairwoman of the board and the majority shareholder of the holding company, Chloe now has the unilateral authority to audit every single subsidiary account associated with Sterling Industries, including the highly irregular operational funds that have been quietly supporting your boutique fitness studio for the past 3 years. If you would like to invite the police to investigate those specific financial anomalies, I am sure the chairwoman would be more than happy to oblige you. Jessica's mouth snapped shut so quickly her teeth clicked. The blood drained entirely from her face. She sank back down into her silk chair, burying her face in her hands, finally understanding the true, terrifying scope of the power I now held over her life. She was completely at my mercy, and she knew exactly how little mercy she deserved. I stood on the stage, the heavy legal document clutched firmly in my hands. I looked out over the sprawling ballroom. The elite guests, the powerful investors, the wealthy socialites who had watched my humiliation with morbid fascination, were now looking at me with something entirely different. They were looking at me with awe. They were looking at me with a profound, terrifying respect. They had thought they were attending a wedding. Instead, they had just witnessed the most brilliant, flawless, and devastating corporate execution in the history of Connecticut high society. I looked down at Brandon. The golden boy of the Sterling family was currently on his knees on the hardwood floor. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled and stained. His cheek was swollen and purple from his father's righteous slap. He was weeping actual ugly tears streaming down his face as he stared up at me. He was completely broken, stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his pathetic illusions of grandeur. He had tried to bury me. He had tried to throw me out into the cold so he could steal the empire I had built with my own hands. But he had fundamentally forgotten the first and most important rule of dealing with an accountant. We never leave the office until the ledger is perfectly balanced, and looking down at the weeping, ruined man on the floor, holding the deed to the entire Sterling legacy in my hands, I knew that the accounts had finally been settled. The debt was paid in full. The holding company was mine. The empire was mine. I had survived the absolute worst they could throw at me, and I had emerged from the ashes as the undisputed queen of the board. The weight of the state-sealed document in my hands felt entirely different from the bouquet of peonies I had been holding just an hour earlier. It was the physical manifestation of justice. I stood on the elevated stage of the country club ballroom looking down at the wreckage of the Sterling family. The silence in the room was absolute and profound. 300 of Connecticut's most influential investors, suppliers, and socialites were holding their breath. They had come to attend a lavish wedding and perhaps witness a bit of scandalous gossip. Instead, they were watching a masterclass in corporate survival. I looked at Brandon. The man I had loved, the man I had covered for the man who had just tried to discard me like a broken tool was still crumpled on the polished hardwood floor. He was clutching his bruised cheek, his expensive tailored tuxedo now rumpled and pathetic. The absolute arrogance that had fueled his cruel speech on the lawn was completely gone. In its place was the raw, unadulterated terror of a man who suddenly realized he was no longer the smartest person in the room. I slowly stepped down from the wooden platform. The soft rustle of my custom silk wedding gown against the floorboards was the only sound in the massive hall. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of an executive entering a boardroom to finalize a hostile takeover. The crowd parted instinctively. The wealthy men and women who had whispered about my working-class background just moments before now lowered their eyes as I passed. Power has a specific gravity, and everyone in that room could feel that the center of gravity had permanently shifted. I stopped right in front of Brandon. He did not try to stand up. He stayed on his knees looking up at me with red, tear-filled eyes. He was searching my face for a shred of the devoted, forgiving woman he had manipulated for 6 long years. He was hoping to find the naive girl who used to stay up until 3 a.m. fixing his ledger mistakes. But that girl did not exist anymore. He had killed her the moment he took the microphone on the altar. I reached into the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of my gown. My fingers bypassed the backup phone I had used to send the evidence to his father. Instead, I pulled out the crisp piece of paper he had aggressively thrown at me in the bridal lounge. I held up the cashier's check. $50,000. Brandon stared at this piece of paper, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. That was his ultimate insult. That was the price tag he had placed on my silence, my career, and my dignity. He actually believed that a meager $50,000 would convince me to walk away while he sold his father's legacy to private equity scavengers. I looked him dead in the eye and grasped the top edge of the check with both hands. I did not say a word. I simply pulled my hands apart, tearing the thick paper straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Brandon flinched as if I had struck him. I placed the two halves together and tore them again, reducing his pathetic bribe into quarters. I let my fingers relax, and the shredded pieces of the cashier's check fluttered down through the air, landing softly on his expensive leather shoes. You told me in the bridal lounge that I was nothing but a glorified human calculator. I began, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional tremor. You said I lacked the vision to lead this company. You mocked me for caring about the rules, the audits, and the hardworking people who actually keep the assembly lines moving. You thought your last name made you untouchable. Brandon opened his mouth to speak, a desperate, pathetic sound escaping his throat, but I immediately raised my hand to silence him. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the chilling clinical precision of a chief financial officer delivering a final audit report. I am not speaking to you as your former fiancé, I stated clearly, ensuring every single guest in the ballroom could hear the absolute authority in my tone. I am speaking to you as the majority shareholder and the newly appointed chairwoman of the board for the holding company that now wholly owns Sterling Industries. The reality of those words seemed to physically crush him. His shoulders slumped forward. The last remaining traces of his defiance evaporated into thin air. As my first official act of business, I continued. My eyes locked onto his. I am formally terminating your employment with this corporation, effective immediately. You are being terminated with cause. The grounds for your dismissal include gross financial misconduct, unauthorized use of corporate assets, and the direct embezzlement of $2.4 million from the Employee Retirement Pension Fund. A fresh wave of shocked whispers rolled through the crowd of investors behind me. Hearing the exact dollar amount spoken aloud officially and on the record solidified the staggering magnitude of his crime. This was not a minor accounting error. This was a catastrophic felony. Your executive access to all corporate servers was completely revoked by our cybersecurity team at 8:15 this morning, I informed him, reciting the operational facts with brutal efficiency. Your company vehicle, your corporate credit cards, and your expense accounts have been frozen and canceled. You no longer have the authority to sign contracts, negotiate with vendors, or communicate with any private equity firms on behalf of this enterprise. You are strictly forbidden from stepping foot on any property owned by Sterling Industries. If you attempt to access the manufacturing plants or the corporate headquarters, you will be immediately arrested for trespassing. I paused, letting the absolute totality of his destruction settle over him. He was losing everything. Not just his job, but his identity, his access to wealth, and his illusion of superiority. You wanted to clean house today, Brandon, I said, looking down at the shredded check resting by his knees. You wanted to restructure your life and eliminate the dead weight. Consider it done. Your services are no longer required. Brandon covered his face with his trembling hands. A loud, ragged sob tore through his chest. The golden boy of Connecticut high society was completely broken, sobbing on the floor of a country club in front of 300 horrified spectators. At the head table, his sister Jessica was staring at the floor, too terrified to even breathe, while his mother Susan sat in a state of catatonic shock. They had spent years treating me like I was entirely disposable, completely unaware that I was the only structural column keeping their lavish lifestyle from collapsing. Now the column was gone, and the roof was caving in directly on top of them. I turned my back on Brandon. I had delivered the verdict. The professional execution was complete. I walked back toward Richard Sterling and William Hayes, handing the state-sealed charter to the formidable attorney for safekeeping. Richard gave me a look of profound, quiet gratitude. We had saved his life's work. We had protected the hundreds of families who relied on those factory jobs. We had amputated the diseased limb before it could kill the entire corporate body. The tension in the ballroom began to slowly uncoil. The guests started murmuring among themselves, likely calculating how quickly they needed to adjust their own financial portfolios, now that the truth about the Sterling heir was out in the open. But the silence was shattered once again this time, by a sound coming from outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. It started as a faint, distant wail, a high-pitched rhythmic siren cutting through the quiet suburban afternoon. The sound grew louder by the second, multiplying, as more sirens joined the chorus. The guests nearest the windows turned their heads, pulling back the sheer white curtains to look out over the manicured golf course and the long, sweeping driveway that led to the country club entrance. Red and blue emergency lights began to violently flash against the glass painting the opulent banquet hall in harsh strobe-like colors. The flashing lights reflected off the crystal chandeliers, turning the luxurious wedding reception into a surreal, chaotic crime scene. Brandon's head snapped up from his hands. He stared at the flashing red and blue lights sweeping across the ceiling of the room. The sheer, primal terror in his eyes was unmistakable. He looked frantically at his father, his chest heaving. "Dad." Brandon choked out, scrambling backward on his hands and knees like a frightened child. "Dad, please, you did not. Tell me you did not call them. Please, I can fix this. I can get the money back. Do not let them take me." Richard Sterling stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He simply watched the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. "I did not call them," Richard said quietly, his voice heavy with the grim reality of a father watching his son's final downfall. "The bank auditors called them the moment William handed over the evidence of the wire fraud. You stole from a federally insured pension fund across state lines, Brandon. This is no longer a family matter. This is a federal crime." The heavy mahogany doors swung open for the third time that afternoon. They did not open for a bride or a groom or a triumphant corporate founder. They opened for the law. 4 individuals strode into the banquet hall. 2 of them were uniformed local police officers, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts as they secured the exit. The other 2 men were dressed in sharp, unassuming gray suits. They moved with a rigid, highly disciplined authority that completely ignored the wealth and status of the room they were entering. Gold badges gleamed from the belt clips on their hips. They were special agents from the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The crowd of elite guests practically plastered themselves against the walls to get out of the way. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the target of a federal raid. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stoic expression, walked directly down the center aisle. His eyes scanned the room briefly before locking onto the man still sitting on the floor in the rumpled tuxedo. "Brandon Sterling." The agent stated his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that demanded absolute compliance. Brandon could not speak. He simply stared up at the federal agents, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled out of water. He tried to push himself to his feet, but his legs failed him. He remained entirely frozen in place, surrounded by the shredded pieces of the $50,000 check he had tried to use to buy his salvation. "I am Special Agent Miller, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The man continued, pulling a folded document from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate misappropriation of federally protected employee pension funds." At the head table, Susan finally broke out of her catatonic state. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and lunged forward, trying to run toward her son. Richard's personal security team immediately stepped into her path, gently but firmly, blocking the hysterical woman from interfering with federal agents.
"No, you cannot do this!"
Susan shrieked, thrashing against the security guards.
"He is a Sterling! You cannot arrest him!"
"Do you know who we are? We know the governor. We know the chief of police. You are making a terrible mistake." Agent Miller completely ignored the screaming matriarch. He did not care about country club memberships or political connections. He cared about the $2.4 million missing from a working-class pension fund. He looked down at Brandon and signaled to his partner. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back, Mr. Sterling," Agent Miller instructed, stepping closer. Brandon slowly, agonizingly dragged himself up from the floor. He looked entirely broken. The golden, charming facade had been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified, pathetic thief facing the absolute ruin of his life. He looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading for a mercy he never once extended to anyone else. I stared back at him with a cold, unwavering gaze. I offered him exactly what he had given me on the altar. Nothing. Brandon turned around and slowly placed his shaking hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly in the silent room. The second agent grasped Brandon firmly by the bicep. Agent Miller began reciting the Miranda rights in a calm, practiced rhythm as they turned the former Golden Boy around and marched him toward the mahogany doors. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent's voice echoed back toward the stage. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I watched them walk him out of the opulent ballroom. I watched the flashing red and blue lights paint his face as they led him through the lobby and out into the waiting federal vehicles. The absolute finality of the moment washed over me, taking with it the last lingering traces of the heavy, suffocating anxiety I had carried for 6 years. The trap had closed. The poison had been extracted. The man who had tried to discard me in public had just been publicly hauled away in steel chains. The empire was secure, the truth was out, and my professional execution was absolutely complete. The red and blue lights of the federal vehicles slowly faded through the massive glass windows of the country club. The wail of the sirens grew distant, eventually dissolving entirely into the quiet afternoon air. Inside the grand banquet hall, the silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The 300 elite guests remained frozen in their velvet chairs, their eyes wide, collectively processing the catastrophic downfall of the Sterling family Golden Boy. The man who had strutted around this room just moments ago, boasting of his absolute power, was now sitting in the back of a federal cruiser in steel handcuffs. The spell of silence was suddenly broken by a sharp, desperate intake of breath from the head table. Jessica Sterling, the sister who had spent the entire morning laughing at my humiliation on the manicured lawn, was completely unraveling. The thick layer of designer makeup on her face was ruined, streaked with dark trails of mascara and tears of pure panic. The reality of Brandon being arrested was not just a family tragedy for her. It was a severe and immediate financial death sentence. Without Brandon funneling stolen corporate funds into her failing boutique fitness studio, without the endless well of the company credit cards to fund her lavish vacations and designer wardrobe, Jessica was nothing. Her entire identity was built on money she had never earned. She stumbled away from the head table, her expensive silk heels slipping clumsily on the polished hardwood floor. She ran toward the center of the room where her father stood. She did not look at me. She could not bear to look at the woman who now held the deed to her entire life. She threw herself at Richard, grabbing the lapels of his dark suit with trembling, manicured hands. "Daddy, please!" Jessica cried, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine that echoed painfully through the cavernous room. "You have to stop them. You have to call the governor or the police commissioner. You cannot let them put Brandon in federal prison. He is your son. He is my brother. You have the power to fix this. You have to fix this right now." Richard Sterling did not move to embrace his daughter. He did not wrap his arms around her or offer her the soft, comforting lies she had been fed her entire life. He stood perfectly rigid, looking down at the weeping woman clutching his jacket. The profound exhaustion on his face was heartbreaking, but his resolve was absolute. He had spent decades watching his wife and daughter excuse Brandon's worst behaviors, brushing off his cruelties and his financial reckless acts as minor mistakes. He had watched them actively participate in the destruction of my dignity today. He was done protecting them from the consequences of their own toxic entitlement. "I cannot fix what your brother broke, Jessica." Richard said, his voice low, steady, and incredibly weary. "I will not bribe federal agents to cover up a felony. I will not sacrifice the retirement savings of 400 innocent working-class families so that you and your mother can continue to pretend this family is flawless. Brandon made his choices. Now he must survive the outcome. But we will lose everything," Jessica wailed, her fingers digging deeper into his jacket. "Our friends are watching. The investors are watching. We will be ruined in this town. Daddy, please do not do this to us." Richard reached up and gently but firmly detached Jessica's hands from his lapels. He held her wrists for a brief second, looking into her panicked eyes, with a sorrow that words could not capture. "You ruined yourselves long before today," Richard replied softly. You just finally ran out of people to blame it on." With those final words, Richard turned his back on his daughter. He physically and emotionally walked away from the endless cycle of manipulation. Jessica let out a loud, devastated sob, her knees giving out completely. She sank to the hardwood floor, a heap of expensive silk and shattered illusions, weeping bitterly into her hands as the truth of her new reality crushed her. At the head table, Susan Sterling watched her husband turn his back on their daughter. The matriarch of the family had spent her entire adult life ruling Connecticut high society with an iron fist. She had organized charity galas, dictated country club memberships, and judged everyone around her based on the size of their bank accounts. She had engineered this entire fraudulent wedding to secure her son's position and eliminate the working-class accountant she despised. But as she looked around the room, the walls of her carefully constructed kingdom were rapidly collapsing. She saw the faces of her wealthy friends, the women she played tennis with, the men who sat on the same prestigious corporate boards. They were not looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her with overwhelming disgust. They had just learned that the extravagant caviar and imported champagne they were consuming had been paid for with stolen pension funds. Susan placed a trembling hand against her chest. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The sheer, crushing weight of the public humiliation was too much for her fragile, ego-driven mind to process. She tried to stand up, perhaps to yell at Richard again, perhaps to run out the doors and hide from the judging eyes. But her legs refused to support her. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and with a soft, pathetic sigh, Susan collapsed. She fainted dead away, her body sliding off the elegant dining chair and landing heavily on the floor. Her silver designer gown tangled in the spilled appetizers and broken crystal from the champagne flute she had shattered earlier. In a normal circumstance, 300 people would have rushed to her aid. Doctors in the crowd would have sprinted forward. Friends would have shouted for an ambulance. But today, the reaction was chillingly telling. Nobody rushed forward. Nobody screamed for help. A few of the private security guards eventually walked over to check her pulse and ensure she was breathing, but the guests simply watched from a distance. The elite society that Susan had dedicated her life to pleasing had instantly deemed her a pariah. She was lying unconscious in a puddle of spilled wine, completely abandoned by the social circle she had sacrificed her own morality to maintain. The sudden collapse of the Sterling matriarch seemed to break the invisible spell holding the guests in their seats. The investors, the bankers, and the corporate partners had seen exactly what they needed to see. They had witnessed the transfer of absolute power. They knew that Brandon Sterling was bound for federal prison, and they knew that the quiet, brilliant accountant they had ignored all day was now the undisputed chairwoman of the board. It started with one table near the back. An older man in a charcoal suit simply stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked quietly toward the exit. His wife followed closely behind him. Within seconds, the trickle turned into a mass exodus. The 300 guests stood up in near unison. The screeching sound of hundreds of wooden chairs scraping against the floor filled the vast ballroom. They did not say goodbye to Jessica, who was still sobbing on the floor. They actively stepped around Susan's unconscious body as the security guards gently lifted her onto a sofa. The guests moved toward the mahogany doors with a hurried, urgent pace, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. As they walked, the whispers grew into a loud, buzzing wave of aggressive gossip. I could hear fragments of their conversations floating up to the stage. They were talking about calling their brokers immediately. They were discussing how completely unhinged Brandon looked in handcuffs. They were marveling at the sheer brilliance of the legal trap Richard and I had executed. Not a single person looked back at the ruined family with pity. They turned their backs on the Sterlings with the ruthless, calculating efficiency of wealthy people discarding a bad investment. Within 5 minutes, the massive, opulent banquet hall was virtually empty. The jazz band had quietly packed up their instruments and slipped out the side door. The catering staff had vanished into the kitchen corridors. The only sounds left in the cavernous room were the gentle hum of the air conditioning, the soft weeping of a broken sister, and the distant echoing footsteps of the last departing guests. I stood on the elevated stage looking out over the empty tables and the discarded remnants of a fake wedding. The heavy gold-sealed charter of the new holding company was still resting securely in my hands. The air in the room felt incredibly light now. The oppressive, suffocating anxiety that had choked my lungs for the past 6 years was completely gone. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the cool air fill my chest. I looked down at the expensive, custom silk wedding gown I was wearing. It had been selected by Susan, paid for by Brandon, and designed to make me look like a compliant decorative accessory. It did not belong to me. It represented a life of constant compromise, a life where I was expected to smile and stay silent while a reckless man destroyed everything around him. I reached up to my dark hair. My fingers found the intricate, heavy diamond pins securing the long, flowing bridal veil to my head. One by one, I pulled the pins out. I did not rush. I felt a profound sense of physical and emotional liberation with every piece of metal I removed. I gathered the sheer white tool in my hands and pulled the veil completely off my head. The sudden absence of the weight made me feel incredibly tall. I walked slowly down the wooden steps of the stage. I moved past the spot where Brandon had kneeled and wept. I stepped over the shredded, worthless pieces of his $50,000 bribe. I walked over to the nearest dining table, the one where the white orchid centerpieces were still perfectly arranged. I gently folded the long white veil and placed it squarely in the center of the table. I left it there, a silent monument to the naive, hopeful girl I used to be, and a definitive marker of the powerful, independent woman I had become. I turned back toward the center of the room. Richard Sterling was standing quietly with his attorney, William Hayes. They were watching me with expressions of profound respect. The older man looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped now that the adrenaline of the confrontation was fading. The toll of his failing heart and the devastation of losing his son to greed were visibly etched into the deep lines on his face. I walked over to him. I did not have any grand dramatic speeches left to give. The time for shouting and proving points was over. The conflict had reached its perfect logical conclusion. The guilty had been punished by their own actions, and the innocent had been protected by the truth. I stopped in front of Richard. I reached out and gently placed my hands over his weathered, trembling fingers. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice soft, steady, and filled with absolute sincerity. "Thank you for believing me when I told you the truth. Thank you for having the incredible courage to protect your employees over your own pride. And thank you for trusting me with the legacy of your life's work. I promise you I will guard it with everything I have." Richard looked down at our joined hands. A single, quiet tear escaped his eye and tracked slowly down his cheek. He squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. "You earned it, Chloe." Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You were the daughter this family needed, and we were too foolish to see it. You are going to be a brilliant chairwoman. The company is safe in your hands. Now go build your life." I offered him a small, genuine smile. I let go of his hands, stepping back. I gave William Hayes a polite, professional nod, which the formidable attorney returned with a rare, approving smile. I did not look at Jessica, who was still curled up on the floor. I did not look at Susan, who was lying motionless on the sofa. I had officially severed every single emotional, financial, and legal tie that bound me to Brandon Sterling and his toxic family. They were no longer my problem. They were simply ghosts in a house I no longer occupied. I turned around and walked down the long, empty center aisle of the ballroom. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood, echoing clearly in the quiet space. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the grand hallway of the country club. I walked out through the main entrance of the club, pushing the heavy glass doors open to meet the late afternoon sun. The air outside was crisp, smelling of fresh rain and cut grass. The sprawling parking lot was empty, the hundreds of luxury cars having vanished as quickly as the illusions they represented. I stood on the front steps, breathing in the unburdened air. I had arrived at this country club a few hours ago as an anxious, manipulated employee, preparing to marry a man who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient human shield. I was leaving as the absolute owner and chairwoman of a multi-million-dollar empire. The journey had been brutal. It had required me to endure public humiliation, heartbreak, and the terrifying prospect of losing my entire career. But I had refused to be a victim. I had refused to let a predator dictate my worth or destroy the lives of innocent working people to serve his own greed. I had armed myself with the absolute truth, and I had waited for the perfect moment to let the facts speak for themselves. I looked down at the state-sealed charter resting in my hands. The gold emblem gleamed in the fading sunlight. I was finally free. I was entirely myself, defined not by the man I stood next to, but by the courage I had found when everything was on the line. I walked down the stone steps and toward my waiting car, ready to take the helm of my new life. If there is one thing you take away from my story, let it be this. Never shrink yourself to accommodate the ego of someone who refuses to grow. Never allow anyone to treat your loyalty as a weakness to be exploited. Your worth is not determined by the people who fail to appreciate you. It is determined by the boundaries you set and the courage you show when you finally decide to walk away from the table. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever had to fight back against manipulation and reclaim your own power, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. And before you go, drop a comment below letting me know exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is in your part of the world. I love connecting with every single one of you. Until next time, remember to always know your worth, trust the truth, and take care of yourself. 6 months have passed since that spectacular afternoon at the country club. The warm morning sunlight now streams freely through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite on the top floor of Sterling Industries. I sit behind the heavy mahogany desk, breathing in the quiet, absolute calm of my new reality. This is the very same desk where Richard Sterling built a manufacturing empire 4 decades ago, and it is the same desk where his son once sat foolishly believing he could tear it all down. The rich leather chair beneath me no longer feels like a borrowed seat or a temporary assignment. It feels exactly like where I am supposed to be. It feels like it belongs to me. I look out over the sprawling industrial complex below. The massive employee parking lot is completely full, row after row of cars shining in the daylight. The distant rhythmic hum of the manufacturing floor vibrates faintly through the soles of my shoes. It is the sound of honest labor, of progress, and of absolute security. The suffocating anxiety that used to sit in my chest like a lead weight, the constant sickening fear of hostile audits and hidden offshore debts, has completely vanished. The air in this office is clear, and the ledger is finally perfectly balanced. When I took control of the holding company 6 months ago, my very first executive mandate was a total financial restructuring. I immediately froze all executive bonuses, revoked every single corporate credit card Brandon had distributed to his reckless friends, and terminated the corrupt upper management team he had installed to cover his tracks. It took me exactly 3 days of relentless microscopic accounting to formally restore the stolen $2.4 million back into the employee retirement pension fund. I will never forget the morning I walked down to the main assembly floor to deliver the news to the staff. The heavy machinery was temporarily silenced. 400 men and women gathered around me, their hands stained with grease, their faces lined with decades of hard labor and recent terrifying uncertainty. They had read the local news reports about Brandon being hauled away in federal handcuffs. They knew their life savings had been jeopardized by the very family they worked for. I did not stand on a high balcony or hide behind a sterile corporate email. I stood right there on the concrete floor with them. I looked into the eyes of machinists, line workers, and administrative clerks who had dedicated their entire adult lives to this enterprise. I told them exactly what had happened. I told them that their money was recovered, their pensions were secure, and their jobs were safe. I promised them that as long as I was sitting in the executive chair, no one would ever treat them like disposable assets again. An older floor manager named Thomas, a man who had worked alongside Richard since the company was nothing more than a single drafting table in a rented warehouse, stepped forward. He took off his heavy protective gloves, shook my hand, and openly wept. That single firm handshake meant more to me than every hollow, manipulative compliment Brandon had ever given me over 6 years. Under my direct leadership, Sterling Industries is not just surviving the scandal, it is thriving. We eliminated the toxic corporate culture and replaced it with absolute transparency. We reinvested the recovered capital into sustainable manufacturing technologies and aggressively expanded our distribution networks across the Midwest. Within my first quarter as chairwoman, we created 150 new high-paying jobs right here in our community. The steady, meticulous financial planning that Brandon used to mock as boring is exactly what made this company an unstoppable powerhouse. I took the raw, brilliant materials of Richard's legacy and built an impenetrable, legally sound fortress around it, Speaking of Richard, the founder of this company is finally experiencing the profound peace he was denied for so long. His physical heart is failing him, the disease progressing just as the doctors predicted, but his spirit has never been lighter. I visit him at his private estate every single Sunday afternoon. The sprawling house is much quieter now, devoid of the frantic, entitled energy it used to hold. We usually sit in his glass-enclosed sunroom, looking out over the gardens that are beginning to bloom with the vibrant colors of early spring. He breathes with the assistance of a quiet oxygen machine, and his physical movements are incredibly slow, but his mind remains razor-sharp. We drink tea, and I walk him through the weekly operational reports. He does not ask about the numbers out of panic or anxiety. He asks because it brings him immense, unadulterated joy to hear about the company flourishing. During my visit last week, Richard reached across the small wicker table and rested his frail, weathered hand over mine. He told me that for years he had lived with a suffocating dread, knowing deep down that his biological son was entirely incapable of carrying the torch. He said that watching me step into the light, watching me take the helm, and fiercely protect the working people who mattered most was the greatest gift he could have ever received in his final days. He looked me in the eye and told me I was the daughter his soul had always recognized. I sat in that sunlit room and cried not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beautiful warmth of finally being seen valued and unconditionally respected by a parent. Richard knows his time is coming to a close very soon, but he will rest knowing that his legacy will live on, completely uncorrupted and undeniably prosperous. The exact same cannot be said for the biological family he was forced to leave behind. The consequences of unparalleled greed are absolute and merciless. Brandon Sterling is currently residing in a federal holding facility completely stripped of his tailored Italian suits, his luxury watches, and his profound arrogance. He was denied bail. The federal prosecutors considered him a severe flight risk given the intricate network of offshore cryptocurrency accounts we had handed over to the white-collar crime division. His highly publicized trial is scheduled to begin early next month, but legal experts across the state are already calling it a mere formality. The paper trail I provided is completely insurmountable. Between the massive wire fraud, the corporate embezzlement, and the attempted illegal liquidation of foundational assets, he is facing a maximum sentence of 25 years in a federal penitentiary. I received exactly one piece of correspondence from him since the afternoon he was marched out of the country club in chains. It was a handwritten letter on cheap, lined institutional paper. The handwriting was erratic, smeared, and completely desperate. He begged me for forgiveness. He pleaded with me to speak to the federal judge on his behalf, to offer a formal character reference to say that his actions were the result of immense corporate pressure rather than malicious, predatory intent. He tried to invoke the 6 years we had spent living together, claiming that beneath his terrible mistakes, he truly loved me. I read the letter once while sitting at my pristine mahogany desk. I felt absolutely nothing. No lingering anger, no tragic pity, no residual attachment. The man who wrote those desperate, pathetic words was a complete stranger to me. He was a small, fading ghost from a past life that I had entirely outgrown. I calmly walked over to the corner of my office, dropped the letter into the mechanical paper shredder, and listened to the satisfying, rhythmic sound of his excuses being reduced to useless ribbons of paper. His mother and sister have faced a brutal reckoning of a different kind. Susan and Jessica Sterling built their entire identities around the grand illusion of endless wealth and superior social status. When the federal authorities formally froze Brandon's accounts, the bottom fell out of their carefully curated universe. Without the constant flow of embezzled corporate funds to sustain them, their lavish, untouchable lifestyle collapsed overnight. They were forced to sell the sprawling family estate at a massive loss just to cover the mounting astronomical legal fees for Brandon's hopeless defense. Susan now lives in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighboring town. She was quietly asked to resign from her prestigious position on the country club charity board. The wealthy women she used to play tennis with, the socialites she used to gossip with and judge people alongside, completely abandoned her. High society is notoriously allergic to criminal scandal, and the Sterling name had become synonymous with catastrophic fraud. Susan walks through the local grocery store unrecognizable, entirely devoid of her designer gowns and her crippling superiority complex. Jessica suffered a similarly devastating reality check. Her boutique fitness studio, which had been secretly bleeding company money to stay afloat for 3 years, folded within a month of my financial audits. Her wealthy fiancé broke off their engagement the very week the news hit the local papers, absolutely unwilling to attach his family name to a disgraced criminal enterprise. For the first time in her 30 years of life, Jessica had to sit down and write a resume. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she recently took an entry-level position at a local retail store. She is forced to actually clock in, stand on her feet all day, and answer to a shift manager. They are learning the incredibly hard way that when you build your life on a foundation of stolen money and sheer cruelty, the ground will eventually swallow you whole. Looking back at the woman I was 6 months ago, the anxious, terrified accountant standing silently in the bridal lounge, I barely recognize her. I spent 6 years of my prime adulthood making myself as small as possible. I swallowed my pride, ignored my own basic needs, and exhausted my mind to fix the catastrophic mistakes of people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient human calculator. I thought that by being useful, I would eventually become lovable. I thought that if I just sacrificed enough of my own light, they would finally see my worth. Blind sacrifice from those who do not appreciate you is never love. It is self-destructive. You do not need to bow down to hold on to a position that does not belong to you. Build your own value, and when the time comes, take back what you deserve. You cannot earn the respect of people who are fundamentally committed to exploiting you. When you bend over backward to accommodate the demands of selfish, arrogant individuals, they do not see your kindness. They see a weakness they can leverage. They will drain you of your energy, your talent, and your life. And when you have absolutely nothing left to give, they will discard you without a single moment of hesitation. Do not wait for someone else to validate your brilliance. Master your craft. Become so undeniably competent that they cannot possibly survive without you. And when they push you to the absolute breaking point, step into the light and bring the receipts. You are not a secondary character in someone else's drama. You are the author of your own life, and you hold the pen. If you have ever been underestimated by the people you trust most, and subscribe to the channel to support stories of seeking justice. Your support builds this community and proves that the truth always finds a way to win. And leave a comment letting me know. Which state or city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? I will read each of your comments. Thank you for listening.